All right, Laura, I'm excited to have you on. Why don't you maybe give like a little bit of a preamble, a little bit of a blurb of who you are? A lot of people will be very familiar with you that are following me. I think we have a lot of overlap. I've shared a lot of your stuff over
Yeah.
the last year or so. And they'll probably know you through the Religious Trauma Institute as
Yes.
well, which a lot of people have been introduced to through Brian, who I've had on my podcast, but
Yeah.
also, again, sharing the amazing
Yeah.
stuff you guys are putting out on Instagram and other platforms as well. It's amazing.
Yeah.
But for those that have been living under a rock, certainly on Instagram, um,
Sure.
tell me a bit about yourself.
Yeah.
Who are you? What are you doing?
Mm.
Why are you doing it? And we can dive a bit more into that. But yeah,
Yeah. Well, yeah, Laura Anderson, that's my birth name. Been living that for a few decades now. Professionally, I'm a licensed psychotherapist in Nashville, Tennessee. I have a private psychotherapy and coaching practice, and the coaching is what allows me to see clients from everywhere. And yeah, so I actually see a lot of religious trauma, but I specialize in complex trauma, which I truly believe religious trauma falls under. And so within complex trauma, I focus a lot on domestic violence, sexual violence, and religious trauma. Um, yeah, and I have, at the beginning of the pandemic, I thought, oh God, like nobody's going to want to come see their therapist. They're going to be
mm,
saving money. They're going to, whatever. And I'm not unique in this, but everybody's going to therapy and it's been crazy. And I think even the correlations between religious trauma connected to the pandemic in various ways, whether it's messaging or political figures or whatever, has really caused a lot of triggers, a lot of feelings of crisis and panic. And so I've
yeah,
seen my caseload explode exponentially, which is a
wow,
wonderful problem to have. But
absolutely.
also, I can't help everybody. So I'm like, I'm so sorry. You can go on my wait list. But there's just so many people that are looking to get support because of everything that's gone on for the roaring 20s, truly. um,
Right, yeah.
yeah, so I that's kind of my day job. I'm also finishing up with my PhD, like
Okay.
looking at like a couple months from today. I
Wow,
was my chair
fantastic.
this morning.
What's your PhD focused on?
Yeah, so it'll be a PhD in mind body medicine. I wanted a little bit different route. I'm a very integrative clinician, and so I love everything. I'm very eclectic, and so this seemed to fit me. The My dissertation topic is the experience of living in a healing body after sexual violence or sexual trauma. So there's a lot of research out there about symptoms of sexual trauma or even like therapeutic modalities around sexual trauma, but there's not a lot of research out there on how do you know if you're healing, like what are the markers of healing.
Mm,
um Especially with when I started my PhD was right around the time Me Too was really
yeah.
surging. And then of course church too came after that, and it just felt like this really relevant topic that there's all these people that have experienced this sexual trauma and have had to hide it and suppress it for such a long time. And there's already great resources out there, and now that it is more available to be talked about and it's not taboo, we've got to start looking at other ways to talk about healing. Is
Mm,
it sexual trauma impacts a person on so many different dimensions, as does all trauma. But I focused on just this slice of it. And so looking at healing is this multidimensional process as well, that mind, body, spirit. And so, yeah, so I'm doing that. I'm using my own story and my own journals as data, which is really fun and super vulnerable, but I'm
right, yeah,
excited
yeah.
what is being put out there. And as it pertains to religious trauma, I also get to weave in the messaging from things like purity culture and
Sure.
how that really had an impact both on my own experiences with sexual trauma as well as it being its own trauma unto itself. And so
Mm,
Yeah, so I'm really excited about that because I think there's a growing niche in research on purity culture in particular, and then religious trauma as a whole. So yeah, so that's rambling, but that's my PhD, and then of course the Religious Trauma Institute, which you already mentioned, that I co-founded with Brian Peck. So I'm really pumped. We met yesterday. We've got a website rolling out soon, and so we were talking content and colors and all the things. And so that's just been, Brian has been such a wonderful colleague to work with. We met on social media a couple of years ago now, and we just have such a similar vision and passion and kind of ideas of how we want to help people. And so it's really wonderful to partner with him as well as many other people to try to provide resources to people who have survived religious trauma through educating therapists and clinicians and advocates and clergy members and all the people that we're trying to be able to target and reach out to. So that's like my preamble, like you said, of who I am professionally. Yeah.
There is so many different things we could talk about. And
yeah.
I'm like a kid in a candy store. When someone gives me too many things, I'm like, oh gosh, where do I begin? I do not even know. I am salivating at all the options, but I do not know which candy to pick. There's so many things there. I mean, I'm so intrigued by so much of the work you're doing. I love the work that you are doing with the Religious Trauma Institute, and I know that you're gathering different researchers and people that are involved in research to try and collaborate and do work together. And I've spoke to so many people that are starting to do research in the area of religious trauma. A bunch of people, a bunch of grad students and master students and stuff have reached out to me going, I'm doing my paper on religious trauma, or I'm doing my paper on purity culture and how it affected me, and I'm researching different people. Can you put me in touch? And I'm like, this is amazing. There's so many people. And I imagine you get this way more than me, even, because you're actually going, hey, if you're doing this, please talk to me. And so it seems like we're on a precipice, really, because I mean, trauma as a whole is a very new area of conversation, really. As far as the age of these kind of conversations go, I mean, psychology is not is a pretty new discipline. Trauma within that is a very new discipline. And then you whittle it down even further and go, oh, like a religious branch within this? I mean, people barely started talking about this in the last few years.
Well, and even within, so we've got trauma as a new field or whatnot, but then within that, as the research has progressed, is this whole, like, I know Brian's talked to you about this, like body-based, like really like somatic processing, as we understand how our body and our nervous system holds trauma, and then how that manifests itself internally and externally far past the event. And so, trauma research started off with trauma as an event. It was the war, it was the car accident, it was the sexual assault. And now we're realizing that's not the trauma. It's that's the thing that happened, but trauma is how our body, how our nervous system responded to that. And so that in and of itself then is even newer. And I think there's a couple people that put it on the map. Judith Herman, her research is amazing, and her big book Trauma and Recovery was out in 1992. And we've got Peter Levine, who does somatic experiencing, who had a lot of his work out like about 5 years after that, Bessel van der Kolk. And so these are kind of the pioneers. Stephen Porges with the polyvagal theory. So we're talking like early to mid 90s, when these pioneers were like, hey, how we've been talking about trauma for the last 25 years, not right. Let's shift. So it's like course correct. And people in psychology are just not great at changing. And so, so, it's finally, I think even with social media, I think we're starting to see more therapists, professionals, and then clients who are starting to have a better understanding of trauma. And then of course, let's now put religious trauma in there.
Yeah.
And people are really starting to have, to understand religious trauma is trauma, the same way sexual trauma is trauma, the same way developmental trauma is trauma. And that just gives so much more than access to resources and to effective care, which excites me as a clinician and a researcher, and as a victim of all of that as well. I'm very grateful for all these resources.
Got a lot more skin in the game as well, where you go, gosh, I would have benefited a lot from having this at that time, or being able to access these resources or people. Yes, absolutely, that's huge. It feels like, I think I mentioned this when I talked to Brian, but the parallel, I know I've got trauma in my life largely because I can't remember most of my life. So that's a like
Sure.
fairly
Yeah.
big trigger there, a warning of like, oh, maybe there's a red flag there. So I know that I've got good stuff going on there, but I'm yet to kind of really figure out even how to begin to tap into that. But the overlap I have is so I live with chronic pain, and some of the components of this are so similar. You know, the way that we've thought we understood how things work, and then in recent years, very recent years, we've gone, oh, pain doesn't work like that at all.
Yeah.
Things like, oh, any pain can actually be quite a significant pain. Even pain that isn't linked to an injury can actually be just as severe or worse than a pain linked to an injury, and things. And it's amazing how we see these different sufferings coming out through the body in different ways, in different dimensions. One of the things I'm fascinated by trauma is, I mean, with it being such a new kind of thing that we have language to put to it, I feel like there's maybe a tendency I've seen for people to presume trauma is everywhere. Right? It's almost like a charismatic preacher looking for devils in every bush, you know?
Yes.
And I feel like we're probably seeing, once you've got language for something, you suddenly are like, oh my God, this thing is everywhere. And I think it is everywhere. I think it's so many places and so much further reaching than they are. And I'm sure you could probably talk on that and flesh that out a bit. But I wonder, do you also see potentially an over diagnosing of trauma, because that's something that I've been observing, and I think I maybe even talked to this a little bit about with this Brian, so you have to forgive me if I overlap, but I think this is such an important thing, and I want to hear everyone's angle and thoughts on this. But I'm really intrigued. Do you think that trauma is as extensively kind of interwoven in our society as it seems to be, as some people are suddenly getting language and going, oh my gosh, I've got complex trauma, and oh, you've got trauma as well, and so do you. I mean, it's possible, but then do you also feel that there's a tendency for people to jump on a new diagnosis or a new kind of category? And can you talk about that? I know that's a terrible question. I just rambled about the topic without asking the actual question.
I'm thinking of like
that's
5
how I
different
roll.
we could go down. And so, like I'll try to kind of go down a couple different paths. And interestingly, I literally just wrote a post about this, a week or so, or posted a post about it a week or so ago. And it was kind of like, I mean, my short answer is the reason I struggle with the statement that everybody has trauma is the same reason that I struggle with everybody is a sinner, because it can become an excuse and a justification. It can decrease survivors, access to help and to care. And well, that's just that person. They're just a sinner, or they're just a trauma survivor and they have their own stuff. And so it is far more nuanced than a yes or no. But I likened it to that because of what you're saying, like, well, everybody has trauma. That's just their trauma. That's just their trauma. And I was like, that sounds so familiar to how I grew up. Well, they're just a sinner. They're just a sinner. You have to forgive them because they sin too. So put that out there. And then the other thing I think to take into consideration is, for such a long time, trauma wasn't a thing. Like, it wasn't on the map, whether we're talking research or being accepted within society or academia or in our clinical settings. And so then we start to get all this research that's coming out, and now, like, good research. And like anything, it's so easy to swing to the other side of the spectrum and kind of like, instead of like severely underdiagnosing, to maybe like way overdiagnosing. And because there is a very real aspect of like, I don't know what's going on in anybody else's body other than my own. I don't know how your nervous system is responding. I also know that how your nervous system responds to something may be very different, and it may be traumatic for you and not for me. And so that's why it can't be this like real yes, like, yeah, it's way overdiagnosed or underdiagnosed or whatever. Now, I do think that it's worth having some conversations around, there can be big events that happen that feel overwhelming, that feel intense, that feel uncomfortable. And that does not equal trauma. It might not feel great. We might even go into a fight or flight response. However, if our body has a chance to come back and find a sense of safety internally and hopefully even externally, it doesn't linger on in our nervous system as trauma. So I think that's maybe where the educational piece is missing a bit, is this recognition that, like, yeah, legitimately, pretty much anything could be considered trauma, just like there is no one thing that absolutely is trauma. Um, but to say, there's some very well-known like Instagram therapists that will say, well, if your parents didn't listen to you, that's traumatic. Could it be?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Are there times that every parent doesn't listen to their kid? Yes. Does that mean we're all traumatized? I don't know. I don't know. Because was there repair that happened after that? Possibly. And if there was, the likelihood of that leading towards trauma may be much lower. Was it
Sure.
constant? Was it also in tandem with other things like neglect and abuse and abandonment? Then perhaps we are looking at something that is leading towards trauma. So I don't know that I can give a succinct answer. I think at some point we'll kind of, like anything, even back out, and that's going to come through additional research, additional experience, people starting to know how to regulate their nervous systems and whatnot. But I don't know that I can give like a very succinct answer to that. Does everybody have trauma? Now I'm gonna like totally discredit, I think, what I just said, because I think there's also excellent research out there that talks about like intergenerational trauma, which kind of I bristle at because it reminds me of like intergenerational sin, which I'm just like, ugh. But I don't know if you're familiar with Resma. I think you pronounce his name like Menakan or Menakan. He writes the book called My Grandmother's Hands, where he talks, his work is all around white-bodied supremacy and racism and oppression, and how that does weave into our DNA and is passed down through generations. I don't discount his work at all. It's excellent work, and very much agree with it. So I don't know how to meld that all together. It's maybe far more nuanced and complex than what my opinions could ever be, or what this conversation could hold. But I do think that there is something when we look at, things like patriarchy and various forms of oppression and racism and whatever, and how that plays out through the generations, that maybe that makes us more prone to trauma, to those traumatic responses. Yeah, that's like another branch of research that's somewhat new, but incredibly fascinating. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question.
These are all wonderful.
Gave like 50 more questions.
Yeah, no, I get this a lot with people will talk about the podcast and they're like, you are terrible at asking questions. And I'm like, yes, check, I know. And they're like, and then like, you don't hold your interviewers answering exactly. And I'm like, yeah, because they usually say something way more interesting because they know much better than I do. And then we go down that rabbit hole. But I think you did a really good job, because I think, first of all, it's such an amorphous topic, right? And I guess I'm wondering, so again, linking to something that, we're talking about internal sciences here. We're talking about soft sciences. Soft science is such a looked down on and snubbed kind of phrase, but we're basically looking at where science is often focused on the external world. You can look at it, observe, and go, that is a 5 out of 10. That is 30 centimeters long. That is 500 milliliters. When you look at something like pain, when you look at like, how are you feeling? When you look at going, what's that trauma response like? I can never know until you communicate on some level. Maybe somehow we'll one day get an amazing, strong enough fMRI that somehow can tell what that movement in the brain means, but who knows, right? Because everyone's brain's wired differently. And I mean, it's just going to be, who knows? Maybe that's like a few hundred years out. Do you think how do you go about trying to navigate this sort of thing of, well, how much trauma is someone experiencing? Maybe, everyone is experiencing trauma on some level. Maybe absolutely through some sort of generational exposure. We all have certain traumas that are caused by these institutional, systems that oppress us or oppress other people and position us in a way that probably is traumatic just to be in power in some weird ways as well. So there's these things, but maybe for some people that's more of a minor trauma. That doesn't particularly cause them to have huge trauma responses every day to all sorts of things, in the same way that if they were attacked as a child and didn't manage to kind of conclude that situation, they're constantly on edge. Do you see there being ways to measure how severe trauma is? I know that when I talked to Brian about, the research that you're trying to put together, you're looking at like scales for trauma and things like that. Does that play in? Is that something we're going to be able to do, to be able to look to someone and go, oh gosh, they have severe trauma, and look at someone else and go,
Yeah.
oh, they have trauma, but it's probably not going to impact them as much. Like, is that possible?
Maybe. Maybe. So, the thought that comes to mind is the kind of the natural ramifications or consequences of trauma. So, again, I don't live in your body, you don't live in mine. So we can witness the exact same thing or experience the exact same thing, and how our nervous system responds to that could be bigger, smaller, more intense, less intense. And neither is right or wrong. It just is. And I could have actually a very small response, but have no access to any sort of resources. Maybe I don't know how to regulate myself or whatever. And so then perhaps the consequences are much larger, whereas you might have an in the moment quite large response, but you know how to access internal safety or a safe, secure connection with another individual who can help kind of bring you back down, or whatever that is. And you go, I'm actually long-term good, like that's fine. And so, one of the things I remember talking about this on my Instagram page. This was a long time ago. So whenever I post about purity culture, I get a lot of a lot of pushback from certain people. And I made the statement, something to the effect of people who are coming out of purity culture often have the same process of healing as individuals who have been sexually assaulted. Got a lot of pushback on that. How can you claim that purity culture is sexual assault? You're taking away my experience, which was not the intent of the post. I literally just said, oftentimes the process of healing is like it, not anything more than that. But one of the examples I used as we're explaining trauma is maybe when you're young, you see somebody streaking down the road naked, and it's very overwhelming for you. And your body goes into some sort of fight, flight, or response, maybe connected to how your parents responded to it, or connected to messaging that you had. And you have a very severe response to it. And it might actually equal somebody who has been sexually assaulted, has the exact same response. Now, the consequences of that might look different. So the things that the person who has potentially been sexually assaulted, their healing process might be a bit more in-depth, intense, overwhelming, long-lasting, whatever that is, than this other person. But it doesn't invalidate, was the trauma better or worse? It just means my body had this response. And so I hesitate to say greater or lesser trauma. Sometimes in the psychological world, they'll call it big T trauma versus little t trauma. To me, anytime that we're comparing traumas, that brings on so much shame, which mimics trauma anyways, that I'm like, so we're just literally making it worse for ourselves and others by putting comparative labels on that. What if we took that off and said, you know what, there are some experiences that will probably naturally have more things that you have to work through, but it's still maybe experienced as trauma in your body, the way that, the same way somebody else experiences something, for something that would traditionally have less consequences associated to it. So I feel like that's the only answer I can give to that question. Because everything I've said for years now, like trauma is subjective, know, and like you said, I can't deny your pain. I'm not in your body. So I don't know what your pain is like. And I can't sit here and say, well, the way you're describing your pain is not the way that I would describe my pain. Mine sounds so much worse. And it's like, I can't say that. I have no idea. And so I think trauma is very similar in that we cannot determine what it feels like in somebody else's body and nervous system, and then how that externalizes or manifests externally.
Wow. It's such a complex and tricky thing, isn't it? Because I guess the tendency to look at the event and compare them, I guess that's the external sciences suddenly, isn't it? Right? It's like, well, we can look at how many bullets were shot in your direction versus, you know, like, or, you know, how many times were you sexually assaulted versus, oh, you weren't sexually assaulted, you were just exposed to a very traumatic ideas about sexuality, or, oh, that's much less than this, or it's a very reductionistic way to approach something. And yet we know that doesn't work, right? Even for pain, you know, you can experience no injury. There's a famous story of a guy in Australia who shot a nail gun through his foot, and he got airlifted by to a hospital for a helicopter, and they were pumping him full of fentanyl, one of the strongest painkillers there's possible. He wasn't even passing out. He was literally just pouring with sweat, screaming nonstop. They eventually managed to cut the boot off. They get the boot off, and between his toes, the nail had gone and hadn't even scratched his feet.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
And yet you could, you know, you could probably put a nail through your foot and not be in any pain because, you know, maybe you go into shock or, you know, whatever. And so the point being, you look at the external thing and go, oh, a nail through the foot is much worse than no nail through the foot. But actually, the no nail through the foot was a worse outcome for someone to experience. And so I think you're right. It's such a subjective thing, isn't it? And I think something I've come across, and I'm really bad at this. I hate correcting people, mostly because I'm not confident anyway, or usually because I'm too confident and I think, Phil, you're just going to be an asshole about this. But I've seen quite a few times recently people talking about that is just a traumatizing theology. That is just a traumatizing idea. So someone mentioned the other day something about hell, I think it was, and they were just like, well, hell is just a traumatizing concept. And
I know exactly.
And I kind of pushed back softly, and I was like, well, to be honest with you, it never was a traumatizing thing for me. I'm sure I've got some trauma somewhere, but that one I've evaluated a lot, and I never really was massively traumatized by that. And yet I work daily with people that have been. I'm not saying it isn't. But I just, the idea that certain things are or aren't traumatizing. Do you have, how do you begin to try and, you know, you talk about purity culture, and so many people that go through purity culture experience these complex, you know, traumatic responses, and yet so many don't. And so how do you begin to deal with that? How do you begin to talk about this? Because with something like sexual assault, we go, well, yeah, that's bad. So let's just stop sexual assaults. That would be a good, like, let's deal with people that are already traumatized, but maybe we could stop traumatizing people. But with something that's a bit more complex, that some people don't respond to in a traumatic way, and actually maybe even it actually helps them, and it was a very helpful process for them. I'm not here to judge that. I'm going to say I have my thoughts on that. But you are saying that's a helpful thing, and it's shaped you and given you purpose, and you know, it might even help you deal with trauma. Maybe your concept of hell might even actually help you go through some very traumatic concepts, right?
Sure.
I don't know.
Absolutely. Yeah.
How do you begin talking about these kind of complex topics that may or may not be traumatic? How do you go about addressing them?
Yeah. So, you know, one thing kind of, and I'm going to tie this back to kind of that last question that we were talking about is, you know, this idea of like the nail through the foot. So like one thing we can do with data, with research is we could say that likely somebody is going to experience more long-term impacts if their arm gets sliced off versus if they get a paper cut. Right? We have research to back that up. Now we can't say indefinitely it will always be worse if your arm gets cut off versus a paper cut, because maybe you got a paper cut and there was some, you know, mold in there. Who knows, right? So we can't say that, but we can start to recognize that certain things may tend to lead towards a specific outcome, but it's that we can't say that absolutely will happen. So, you know, I don't remember if you and Brian have talked about the like adverse religious experiences and kind of how we're framing that. And one of the things that we've talked about is what we think we'll be able to say is like, hey, if you've had some of these, like they don't equal trauma, but if we start compounding them on top of the other, the likelihood that your body might experience that as trauma could increase, right? So that's about, in my opinion, and I think I can find research easily to back this up, like that's about as far as we can go because of that trauma and subjectivity and how trauma actually works in our body. So then going back to this message of hell is traumatizing, purity culture is trauma. I understand what these people are saying.
Right.
I've seen a lot of those messaging too. And I, like you, cringe and I go, oh, we can't say that.
Yeah.
Because trauma, like I said, is subjective. It is embodied. It is subconscious. It's all these things, but it's not in the event. It's not in the teaching, right? Because that's why we don't fear teachings from other religions, because
Right.
who cares, right? So the trauma isn't in the teaching. It's not in the belief. It's in the way our body, our nervous system, like embodies that, responds to that. So I would say, how do we combat this conversation is we have to have an accurate understanding of what trauma is and what it is not. And that is this recognition that it is our nervous system's response to the thing that happened, but not the thing itself. And so to your point, then one person may have had, a very terrifying experience with the teachings of hell. And then you have another person over here whose parents mentioned it by the by, but they went to a really progressive church and they, whatever. And you go, so, and that person isn't traumatized. So you have to look at that and you go, so that the trauma can't be found in just the specific thing. It has to be in our body's response. So I would challenge anybody who says this is always a traumatic thing or teaching or belief or whatever. And I would say, I think it's likely that if that's what you're taught, it could very easily lead to trauma or to living with trauma. But to say hell is a traumatic teaching, or a belief in hell, or purity culture is trauma, that feels very fundamentalist in a way.
Right.
Right. So then what if I'm not traumatized by that thing? Does that mean I'm not wrong? My experience wasn't wrong, or maybe I'm living in denial and I'm not actually seeing this, or I'm impacted and I don't know it. And it's gonna come out later in life. Well, I mean, maybe, but no, maybe you just weren't impacted by it. I have a good friend of mine, I'll use a couple of them. Two of my good friends went to the same church growing up, taught the exact same things, but internalized them in such different ways that the unpacking or the healing that they had to do looks like they went to two different churches and two different religions and two different upbringings. My one friend over here is like, I mean, that's stupid. I'm not going to believe that, and my other friend who's sitting next to her in youth group is like, this crushed me. This devastated me. So I go, I can't get on board with this idea that this belief, this doctrine, this theology, this event is unequivocally trauma.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and you know what? I understand when you've been traumatized by something. It's very hard to break that up and be in a place where you can take a step back and be like, oh, actually, it's not this. It's this over here, and and I'm not here, and I'm sure you're not here to go, whoa, you need to figure this out. But I do think there's potentially a lot of fallout from doing stuff like that. Like you're saying, people maybe doubting their own experience. I certainly, when I first started coming across so many people that were trauma informed and teaching on that, and I was like, and they probably didn't even say this belief is traumatizing or that, but I internalized it that way, and I was like, oh, where's my trauma? And I'm looking for trauma. I don't particularly see trauma. What's going on? And I'm like, oh, maybe I just need to look harder, maybe whatever, and that just wasn't a helpful introspective dive for me. Maybe that might be a really helpful introspective dive for some people, and they might go, holy crap, there's some trauma there. I need to go speak to Laura or someone like that. So, but probably not you, because your wait list is through the roof right now.
Ridiculous. Yes. But that'll be changing soon. So there's another project I'm working on with that. So But absolutely.
So there's lots of these things. So I guess, you mentioned there, there's these adverse experiences, and Brian has mentioned these in passing. We've not really dove into these in a huge way. And so maybe it'd be quite interesting to unpack these.
Yeah.
Do you want to do that first before I ask a question? Because I'd love for you to unpack that. And so you'd maybe inform my question before I ask a really dumb question. But
let me
can you define the difference?
Yeah. Has he ever kind of read our definition of what we call adverse religious experiences? I can't remember. if he's read it on this
I don't
podcast.
recall him reading it. If he gave it, it was off the top of his head because I don't recall him reading one.
And Brian is
but
a
yeah.
wordsmith and does amazing with this. He probably has it memorized. I don't. So I'm actually just scrolling on our Instagram right now. I'm going to grab that because I think it's a great starting point to kind of have. So this definition, it is one that we are building off of, but this is something that we collaborated with the Reclamation Collective on to create this definition. And then as we're pushing the research forward. So the way that we kind of our baseline, where we're starting from, is that an adverse religious experience would be any experience of a religious belief, practice, or structure that undermines an individual's sense of safety or autonomy and or negatively impacts their physical, social, emotional, relational, or psychological well-being. So that's like a whole mouthful. And you're like, oh, so again, it could be anything. Yeah, pretty much. But we've kind of gone back and forth. And I think now that we have the collaborative research group, this will be able to be kind of fleshed out in a bit of a different way. One of our inspirations was the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experience.
Oh,
we're back.
I lost you for a bit. Sorry. Do you want to jump back?
This is my internet connection. Okay, sorry.
You're fine. You are back. And so you just broke up when you just mentioned the ACEs study. ACEs.
Okay. Yeah. So, ACEs is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, and it was pioneering. It still is one of the most widely known and well-researched studies that has done a whole ton of good for things like developmental and complex trauma. The way that the ACEs study is set up, and I don't know that it would be set up if they created it today, it would be like this, but they basically have 10 categories of kind of different things that could have happened. Everything from physical abuse to, sexual abuse to a parent with an addiction or a parent with mental health issues, or 10 different categories. And it was set up to say, like, if you can score 1 to 10 based off of how many of these categories you fit in. And so likely the higher the ACE score, the more likely that you would be to suffer from developmental trauma, which, kind of would be evidenced by these symptoms here. So we've thought about going about it that way, of having categories of, psychological, relational, social, spiritual, physical, sexual, like, here's kind of, if these were kind of your experiences or these were your beliefs or whatever, and we start kind of compounding them on top of each other, the likelihood that it would result in religious trauma may be greater or lesser depending on how you would score. That was the original thought. I'm not sure if we're going to still go that direction. And I think a lot of it's going to depend on kind of how the collaborative research group goes and where they want to take the research at an individual level and then get it back to us or whatnot. So that's really adverse religious experience. A lot of people don't identify with the term religious abuse or spiritual abuse. It's that term kind of feels really heavy or really connected to, say, like clergy sexual abuse. Mm-hmm. And so they'll say, oh, I didn't have any sort of religious abuse because, my youth pastor didn't sexually abuse me. And that's true that, that it didn't happen, but it doesn't mean that there weren't other harmful experiences. So this was our way of being able to kind of expand the conversation a bit and to say there was these harmful teachings or practices, these harmful or toxic theologies, these ways that you had to live your life or think or feel or interact with others that had very specific outcomes or, kind of detrimental, adverse outcomes. And so that's kind of where we're like sitting with it right now. I'm sure Brian's mentioned like this survey that we've done, and I think we have over like 2,500 respondents to it. And what it's indicated has been like, as a result of, having adverse religious experiences, I think the top 3 are shame, powerlessness, and fear. That, that is the result of having experienced an adverse religious experience or more, and being able to see that as detrimental and shaping of the way they see themselves or the world. So that's kind of a long, rambly, what is adverse religious experiences. basically because outside of the definition, we haven't done a lot of succinct research around it. It's just coming.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. That's fantastic. That's just really interesting and very helpful. And coming from a bit of a research background as well, I feel you on new areas where you're trying to be like just defining initially
Yeah.
and then trying to figure out, oh, did we
Yeah.
even hit the definition when we start to like look at that? And you have such a lot on your plate. I will say I'm deeply envious. 2,500 responses is like amazing. You know, you've got a lot of data there to play with.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, that's really fascinating. And so I think knowing that difference is so huge though, because I mean, what you're describing there with a religious adverse experience, like you said, almost anything could become that on some level. And you listen to that list and you're like, yeah, I bet you I've had a few of those. I've had a few adverse experiences, but realizing, oh, but that's probably what it was. That doesn't necessarily mean I have some deep-seated trauma. Let me look at that. Does that come up again often? Do I've got stuff in my body coming up every time I think about that, or every time a similar scenario comes up, or like those are two very different experiences, you know, and even that they can be really negative. Like it's not to say that when you think about that, you don't get flooded with, you know, upset or remorse or regret, or, you know, like you can have a lot of negative response to looking back on that or to reliving that on some level, but it's different to trauma potentially.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it validates all experiences as well, right? So, oh, well, I don't have religious trauma. So I guess that means I have to maybe discount these things that happened, or maybe it wasn't so bad because it didn't lead to a result of trauma. And I think giving that language helps us understand that, like, no, you may have had some really harmful or adverse or abusive experiences, and them not leading to trauma does not make them any less valid. And it probably means that, you know, you could have other outcomes from it. It could be, you know, attachment related things or anxieties or depressions that may not be religious trauma, but they still are impactful and they still are things that you're dealing with. And so I think when we can expand that conversation a bit, it gives people language to understand, like, what the hell happened to me? You know, like, why is it that when I hear worship music as I'm, you know, flipping through radio stations, my heart starts beating? Does that mean I have trauma? Well, maybe, but maybe not. Maybe it's that was, you know, it reminds you of another time. And it was a really painful time that, you know, that maybe you've grieved that time, but it still is painful, you know? And so I think it allows for people's experiences to be validated, as well as like then giving language to understand why these compounded experiences may have also resulted in something bigger, that wasn't just, in a box or in a vacuum, but that there was a long lasting effect similar to developmental trauma. That, maybe witnessing my parents' mental health issues and addictions, that was just my normal, but that helps to understand, oh, well, that's why I move into the fawn response so quickly. And that's why, you know, I repeat these behavioral or relational patterns or whatnot. So yeah, I think it just starts to expand as well as validate the experiences, the very real experiences that people have had.
Yeah, I mean, we live in a golden age for this, right? I mean,
Oh,
certainly, I mean, the next moment is going to be the moment on Earth that has the most information available to us and the best research available and all that. And then the moment after that, we'll have a whole bunch more papers published and whatever else, and more therapists around to tell us how to heal. And so it does feel like just being alive today, we have so much more at our hands, you know, recognizing. So I'm somewhat on the ASD spectrum somewhere, I don't know. But that was not an option for me as a kid growing up. That just, I mean, certainly in a lot of my schooling was kind of more rural as well. So even if it was on the table, it probably wasn't where I was. And I only in the last couple of years looking at it and going, oh, wow, this is why I'm like this. And being able to look back in my childhood and go, gosh, poor Phil. No wonder you were overwhelmed by this. No wonder you felt like you didn't want to do it this way, or you know, whatever. Because I'm like, geez, like I'm a grown ass adult and I don't want to do it that way anymore. And I struggle with change. Like poor, like 11-year-old Phil or 8-year-old Phil. And so it's things of like, it gives a context, so doesn't it? And in some sense, I think that provides some capacity for healing. Just understanding does an amazing job and creates an amazing window. And I guess, you know, there's so many amazing therapists out there that are doing wonderful work in healing people that are
Mhm.
working through their trauma and giving them tools and helping them process and explore. Um,
Yeah.
I guess my question is, and I've read different books about trauma and different things like that, and I probably am like one of these people that knows enough to probably do no good, but knows enough to now not do any more harm, hopefully. So I'm
Yeah.
somewhere in the middle. I've not done enough to get to the point where I can help myself too much or others.
Love.
But I do wonder, can people work through this themselves? Is there,
Mm.
you know, because trauma, I mean, we're talking some deep-seated
Yeah.
stuff, right? I mean, it's just really in there. And I do wonder, most of the practices I've come across, most of the stuff, even that people are researching just now, even with things like, oh, we're looking at ketamine or psychedelics. Those have incredible potential, but they're not like, here, eat these shrooms, you'll be fine. They're
Yeah.
like, here, eat these shrooms, and we're going to sit and walk you through one hell of a journey, and this is going to be a
Yeah.
rough one. Like,
Yep.
so it's still very much like, hi, professionals are here to guide and to assist.
Yeah.
And so things like that make me wonder,
Yeah.
to what degree are people able to self heal and
Yeah.
walk themselves through this journey? Because honestly, I mean, if nothing else, in America where you are, guess what? Free access to therapy, not a thing, right? I mean, I know Reclamation Collective are doing great work in helping try and
Mhm.
make things more affordable for people and put them in
Yeah.
contact with people that have more sliding scales and things like that. But at the end of the day, a lot of people just don't have access to
Very true.
be able to have someone walk them through their trauma. Do you have thoughts on
Yeah.
how accessible walking yourself through trauma is, and maybe some tools or ideas of how people can even
Yeah.
begin to think about that?
Yeah. You know, okay, so I am a huge believer that we have what we need within us to heal, but we sometimes just don't know how to access that. I think that's where a therapist can come into play. And so, this idea of self healing, in one way, I think is incredibly empowering because it lets you know that, like, I can do this, right? But I think at the other side of that coin is that there are people that are trained to do this. And I'm not saying all therapists are great. They certainly aren't. There is some very trauma uninformed therapists. There is some therapists that should not be therapists. Like, I certainly don't think that that simply going to a therapist is this magic cure or whatnot.
Sure.
I think that we are getting really good at making certain resources accessible, easily accessible, even through books, through podcasts, through social media, through YouTube, and these sorts of things that are great places to start and great places to just develop your own knowledge about trauma. And I direct people. I mean, I kind of have my go-to list of resources, and I'm like, all right, if you can't afford therapy, you're going to start with this book, and then you're going to move to this Instagram account, and then you're like, whatever. I think one of the things, though, that having a therapist can do, I mean, I think there's a lot of things, but trauma so often happens in the context of relationships.
Mm.
And as a result, we often isolate, we often go inwards, we often just live from a place of shame, from hypervigilance, from freeze, from all these things. And it feels like relationships are like the last thing that I want. You know, if I've been harmed by
Mm.
somebody, why would I want to engage in that? But there's something about a therapeutic relationship that offers a different kind of ability to heal, that we heal in the context of relationships as well. And there is something really special about a trained, not just a trauma informed therapist, but a trauma trained therapist that can help you regulate yourself and
Mm.
get even more in tune. Like, for instance, I really like somatic experiencing. I think Brian's talked about it too. Both of us are
Yeah.
in training to be somatic experiencing practitioners. I think both of us, I can't speak for him in terms of how long, but we both have been going to somatic experiencing therapists for quite some time. So I knew of this idea of trauma, but I was like, oh, I don't know. I don't know if that's me. Now I'm like, of course it was me. Like, yeah, very clearly me. However, way before we got to any of the trauma processing and resolving the trauma, I think I probably spent close to 18 months developing a relationship with my therapist
Mm.
that I had never really had a safe relationship. I had never been modeled how to have conflict with somebody and it not drag me into this shame spiral, and I'm afraid I'm going to go to hell. I didn't have access to some of that. And so it felt like, oh my gosh, I'm going to therapy and I'm paying this person to like be in a relationship with me, to be there for me. And yet it wasn't until that was established and my body even trusted that relationship that processing could actually happen.
Yeah.
Fast forward to my current therapist, and I've done all this work around relationships and being in my body and all this thing. And it used to take me 12 to 18 months to like really feel safe with somebody. And yet this therapist that I'm working with, I cry every session, which to me is like a huge validation of safety, that my body actually feels safe enough to cry. And it happened from the very first session. And I don't think it's because she's some magic wizard or whatever. It's that I was witnessed, like that pain, that grief in me was witnessed in such a beautiful way that allowed me to heal in a way that I didn't even really know that I needed. But that then deepens me into other work. And I have the luxury of being a therapist. I know how to do this work on myself.
Right.
And I do it on myself a lot. But there is something different when there's somebody else in the room who's catching me going, hold on, slow down, drop back into your body. What's going on right now? And there is something really special about that. So I think self-healing is wonderful. I think that the resources available to people are exponentially increasing and they're good, really good resources. But I think you can't discredit the relational aspect of it. And you know what? It could be that you have a really safe, stable, solid friend or partner or something that can offer that to you, that knows how to help you stay grounded. So I'm certainly not discounting like that as well. But I do think that if there is availability and access to a therapist that can just show up and help you just come back home to yourself, or, kind of lead you or guide you or help you develop some coping skills. Like there is something really powerful about that. And this is like a little soapbox I get onto, but therapists get a bad rap on Instagram, like a lot. And sometimes for good reason, because we don't always have the corner market on healing, but there is something to be said that, a lot of us have done a lot of school, a lot of extra training, have spent buco bucks and time, trying to really do this. And we are the only profession, I think, where our profession, like our experience, our education is devalued in favor of just get a good friend, like I could read several books on oncology and cancer and integrative treatments. I am not qualified to treat your cancer, right? I've got hundreds of haircuts in my life. I am not qualified. I should not cut your hair. It would not be good, right? I leave that to the professional. And so it is interesting, I think, and maybe this only happens on social media, I don't know, but I do see people being like, just get a good friend, just, and in some cases that is exactly what needs to happen. I'm not discounting that at all. I also just want to kind of bring light to this idea that like, there's a lot of therapists who are so passionate about this work and who spend so much time, money, energy, effort, not only healing themselves, but pouring that back into other people. And while the letters behind your name don't always matter, there is something to be said for the work that therapists can do with you. So that's my little rant. But yeah, I don't know if that answered the question.
No, it's great. It's amazing. And yeah, I mean, there's so much at play here. And yeah, a lot of people can't access therapy. A lot of people, if they prioritized it, could. They really could. And I think, I fall into that category where, like, you know what, if I cut out all the different things I really enjoy every month that I probably don't need to do, or if I bought a few less books, I could meet up with a therapist every 2 weeks or a month or something. So we all, have different give and takes, but some people cannot do that. And I think
Yes.
saying it's not possible, I think, like you're
Yeah.
saying, it's of course, no, the body is amazing, and you
Yeah.
can resource and you can access these
Yeah.
things. But saying it's going to be easier or easy,
Yeah.
probably not, right? I mean, it is going to be
Yeah.
easier if you get a successful person on your side,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that's
It's a,
just kind of obvious, generally speaking.
yeah.
I would have thought,
You know,
but
in a way, that's the therapist, like being the guide, right? So, you know, I'm prone to this too. Like, gosh, when I realized here's all this trauma, I wanted to dive in, like cannonball into it. That is not the way to deal with trauma. I'm going to just put that out there. Like, I know everybody's subjective. We all have different things that work to us, but cannonballing into it almost never works, right? I needed my therapist to go, okay, we're going to pick you up, come back out of the pool. We're going to dip our toe in, and I was like, oh, are you kidding me? But yet that was the only way it was going to
yeah,
heal, because I was re-traumatizing myself by cannonballing
yeah,
in. So I think that idea of like therapists as guide, and my clients, they laugh at me. I think I had this conversation 3 times today. They're like, why aren't we going faster? I'm like, I mean, well, we had this conversation 6 months ago and I said, sure, go faster. And what happened? You became so overwhelmed, and
yeah,
it's reminding ourselves, like, our body, we have to go at the pace of our nervous
yeah.
system. We have to. Sorry, my little dog is just licking herself over here. Um, we have to go at the pace of our nervous system. And sometimes we just don't know that to
Yeah,
begin with, especially, these capitalistic societies that value productivity over everything else. Why wouldn't we just jump into trauma and
yep.
completely overwhelm our nervous system and go as fast as we can, and then do a lot of harm to ourselves in the meantime? So yeah, that's probably a different conversation for a
Yeah.
different day.
No,
In
no. I
terms
mean, that's a huge one. I've been in conversations online where this is people have
yeah,
said, "Hey, I'm just trying to listen to my body. I'm pacing myself," and other people
yeah.
jump in and go, "Have you heard of exposure therapy? You just need to like really expose yourself and you'll be fine."
Oh,
And I'm like, "But that might have worked for someone. I don't know. I can't say it wouldn't.
sure.
Maybe
Yeah,
maybe you did that and that's wonderful. But also maybe your spider phobia is not the same as someone that's dealing with having been
yeah,
abused or like
yeah.
or whatever." Um,
Absolutely.
and
Absolutely.
so and that's one of the things I was gonna ask about. People that are starting to explore this and do this on their own terms. I
Hmm.
am that person. I jump into the pool as a cannonball with everything. I will
Yeah.
lick my ice cream cone with such vigor that ice cream will fall off. I will open the door. I'll break the handle. I
Yeah.
do everything with
Yeah.
5,000% force. I mean, that's
Yeah.
just the way I think and do things. And my
Yeah.
wife will tell you, I cover myself in cuts and bruises all day because I'm
Yeah.
just, that's how I approach life. I'm learning to slow down, learn to listen to my body. But with something like
Mm.
trauma, with something like, oh gosh, there's an issue here I need to work on in my life, I am like, okay, let's read 20 books about it. Let's like
Yeah.
dive into every possible harm that could ever
Yeah.
have happened to me and like and just dig it up. And
Yeah.
that's just not necessarily helpful. And I have seen people that do try and do this work on their own
Hmm.
get in over their heads very quickly. And with something like trauma, you might literally be day one, hour zero, go, I don't know if I have trauma at all. Anyway, maybe I should consider it. I've read, the
Yeah.
body keeps the score, and I'm like, oh, that's
Yes.
interesting. Let me just think about this, And within 20 minutes, they are like palming their way out of the pool, drowning. They've swallowed half the pool. They are freaking out, and they go, what just happened to me?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
guess and maybe some of this is maybe being much more somatic in our practice, or I'm not sure, but for people that are kind of trying to figure some of this stuff on their own, like they maybe don't have someone
Yeah.
alongside, or maybe they have some great people alongside, but they're
Yeah.
not informed enough to kind of know
Right.
and spot kind of warnings and triggers that a
Yeah.
therapist does. How do you go about kind of pacing yourself in this
Yeah.
journey? How do you go about kind of like making sure you don't, get over
Yeah.
your head too quickly? If that's possible, I'm
Yeah.
sure people will make mistakes on the way.
Yeah, for sure. We all do. I think the simple answer is it comes back to listening to your body, of really starting to develop a relationship to and with your body, to say, oh, I'm reading for 10 minutes, but at minute 11, my heart starts racing. I start getting, okay, well, can I just be curious about that? And can I go, well, what would happen if I like put the book down? Then what happens in my body? Oh, my heart starts to calm back down again. What does that tell me? What's the information there? It's telling me I got about 10 minutes of tolerance in me for this stuff. And I might need to give myself permission then to step back. I think there is a valuable psychoeducation piece within trauma, especially within complex trauma, which again, I consider religious trauma to be. But complex trauma is oftentimes there's not like one thing that you can point back to and say, this thing happened. So you think about a car accident, there was a before and an after, right? I remember all the times that I was driving on the road where I didn't get into an accident, or I didn't see an accident, or I was in some ways it's actually very easy to deal with that event, even if it leads to trauma, because we can access the before. Okay, well, let's go back to driving on the road when it was safe. Let's and do some somatic work around that. When we talk about complex trauma and religious trauma is included in that, there wasn't usually a before, right? There was never a point where I didn't have these teachings in my life, where I wasn't, in my opinion, being brainwashed to be believing and living out and relating to people in very specific ways. And for me, that also included divorcing myself from my body, believing my body was evil, believing that I had to not only not listen to my body, but completely deny my body. Like, gosh, if I could, like, it sounds so silly, but like, how many times did I not go to the bathroom when I actually really had to go to the bathroom because I was denying my body, because I was like, oh, whatever, I don't need to do that. I don't need to care for myself in that very, very simple way. Wow. Right. And so I think that, I think the body is the entrance place to kind of working with trauma, becoming familiar with my body, with my nervous system, how that interacts. I'm really a big fan of Peter Levine, and he has this great tiny little book. It's probably less than $10. You probably could find it for free somewhere. It's called Healing Trauma. Like, that's it, just Healing Trauma. And he gives tons of practices and exercises to start to develop a relationship to your body, noticing different sensations, kind of starting to track some of that, starting to get into your body, notice what is safety. When we talk about internal safety, like, what is that? And how can we start to develop that? I think he is an excellent resource. And I would say that is a wonderful place for any person to start who goes, I'm not sure, because those are great skills to learn regardless.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Not, right. And so I think that can be a really great resource, a really great place that people can start to go, oh, I'm noticing this is happening, or I'm noticing, gosh, when I actually sit still, there is a lot going on inside of me that I've just not paid attention to. And so it doesn't have to be this big overpowering process. You said, I give 5,000% to everything. I'm like, great. Can we give 5,000% to dipping your toe in?
Right.
And then the next toe or step that we take in, can we give 5,000% to that? It's not about changing who you are and not going after it with all the vigor. It's just slowing it down. And the thing is, trauma is often something that is too much, too fast, too soon. And it's like, okay, so then the antidote to that is slow, right?
Yeah.
Which of course we don't like, because we want a quick fix. We want to be able to, if everybody had access to psychedelic therapy where they could take the mushrooms, be guided through the therapeutic trip, like, great, that would be awesome. We're probably 20 years off from that. We don't want to wait that long. So I always say slower is better when it comes to healing trauma. And what we start to notice is that the slower we go, the faster we're able to go. And so when we start to develop that sense of internal safety, that ability to connect to our body, understanding what's happening, there comes points then where we can start moving faster because we're noticing the slower that's happening in our body. Does that help?
Yes,
that book
wonderful, really great
starting point. And I would say this, if that even feels too overwhelming, because sometimes that can feel too overwhelming. There's another excellent book, full disclosure, my therapist wrote it. And it's called Mind, Body, Stress, Reset. And so what most people don't know is stress and trauma same thing. Like how our body perceives that. There's traumatic stress and then there's stress, right? And so sometimes actually stress feels like a safer way to get into doing some of this body work, because we're not maybe necessarily connecting it exactly to the trauma. And so Mind Body Stress Reset, excellent book, just came out, I want to say maybe in November, December of 2020, and chock full of both education and amazing exercises that are very easy to implement and really get you like started on that path towards developing internal safety and stabilization, connecting back to your body. Love it. Absolutely love it. Highly recommend it. And that's not just because she's my therapist, but also because she's my therapist. But yeah, that's wonderful awesome stuff. And both of those books really are through the lens of somatic experiencing, which is that specific modality that Peter Levine created. So yeah.
No, that's great. What's the name of the author for that?
So Rebecca, Rebekkah, Ladyne, LADYNE.
All right, I just want to write it down because I know I'll get messages and people ask. I'll probably put links in the show notes to some of these things.
Yeah, so. It's so good. It's so good. And there actually is a woman on YouTube, and she's on Instagram too, but she has a free YouTube channel, and her name is Irene Lyon, Lyon. And she, I mean, she's also through the lens again of somatic experiencing. However, tons of free videos and resources that talk about various aspects of our nervous system, our body, trauma responses. And so again, I think that psychoeducation can sometimes be very helpful for complex trauma, religious trauma, because sometimes we're just needing to know, like, what the hell is going on inside of me? Yeah. And so having even a basis of like, oh, that makes sense under this lens. This is not some inherent flaw that I have within me. I am not broken. This is a result of how my body is learning to survive as a result of the things that happen. And that can reduce a lot of shame, actually, to say that this is not just because I'm not working hard enough, or I don't want this enough, or maybe I like to be a victim. It's like, no, this is the stuff that happened and how your body is responding to it. So I would say those are like kind of my 3 go-to resources of like, they're all free or very inexpensive. And if therapy is not an option for whatever reason, these would be great starting points.
Wonderful. That's amazing. That is so helpful. I wonder with stuff like this. So I have incredibly bad interoception. You know, I'm not aware of what's going on in my body. And part of that's maybe linked to some of my kind of more autistic kind of tendencies. Maybe that's just part of who I am, or however that works. But I do wonder a lot of how much that is ingrained. Just growing up in church, growing up in a world where the body is secondary to the spirit, whatever that is. And, you know, I mean, whatever that looks like. And I guess I wonder.
We're not talking for a second. We're talking.
No, exactly.
Second.
It's first, and no, that doesn't matter.
Yes. Exactly.
Yeah.
Body.
No, it's.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we're extremely, dualistic the way we see that. You know, maybe the mind gets in here somewhere, but only as the vehicle to serve the spirit. And it's certainly the mind is way above the body even still. Yeah. So, I mean, you know, the body just is not welcome here. And a lot of that's our weird puritanical stuff. The body is dirty. The body is unhealthy, evil, whatever it might be. Do you think... I've come across a lot of people within religious trauma that are very divided on this topic, and I've asked Brian as well. But I from following you, I have an idea of how you answer this. But I know people would love to hear your thoughts on this. And I don't think there is a right answer necessarily, so don't panic about giving the perfect answer or anything. But do you think religion is inherently holding people back from their trauma work? Do you think people can hold to religious persuasions? Do you think people can have spirituality? I know like certain people like Marlon Winnell, who's very popular, is extremely anti-religion. She wouldn't even have me on her. I asked, would you come on my show? And she's like, no, because on some level you help people who are still spiritual, and I'm not willing to talk to people that are doing that. And I was like, fair enough. Fair enough. That's your thing. But I was like, that's a strong stance. That is a very black and white. No religion, any kind of spirituality. It's just no. That's going to further perpetuate harm and trauma. But you know, there's and on the other side of going, yeah, no, it's fine, not a problem. I'm sure there's a whole world in the middle somewhere. But where do you stand on this? When people come to you and they're looking to deal with their trauma, I'm sure at times you must see them coming from a certain religious background and going, this is going to be hard to work on if we can't
Mhm.
kind of whittle away at some of this or some of that,
Yeah.
which can often be key components of who they are, right? You know, your
Yeah.
religion and who you are so
Mhm.
interwoven at times.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh, very much so. Yeah.
do you have
Yeah.
thoughts on this? Is it possible to do this work with that, you know, with the religion, without religion, spirituality interwoven there?
Yeah. So I very much am not anti-religion. And that's how I advertise myself as a clinician. It's also how I believe. To me, holding that position of you must not be religious or you must be an atheist, to me that feels incredibly fundamentalist, just at the other side of the spectrum,
Sure.
right? You have to have believe these things, do these things in order to be living the right way or the most beneficial way. I am certainly not against people identifying with agnosticism, humanism, atheism, whatever it is like that. But I want that to be their own choice. If that is, like that they've
Yeah.
come to this point because of how they've deconstructed or the own work that they have done. Now, what I am against vehemently is control, harm, power, abuse, oppression, anything like that.
Mm,
So if there is a way to be involved in a religion or a spiritual tradition that is not also including those things, great. That's great. I
mm,
mean, and my job as your therapist is not to ever have you believe what I believe. Now,
sure.
I know that I hold a unique position. My clients follow me on social media. I don't care. Like I'm not hesitant to talk about certain things with them. I've been on many podcasts that they've asked similar questions. So my clients generally know where I believe, which is fine. But they also know like my goal is never to make them little minions of me.
Right.
That is not what I want.
You're not
What
the
I
pastor therapist, right?
know, oh, God,
Oh.
no. Right? No, but they also know from our work together that I am very interested in helping them figure out what's right for them. And I have clients all over the spectrum in terms
Mm,
of non-religious, progressive religion, a different religion than what they grew up in, a different form of spirituality. I don't particularly see that as a hindrance as long as they are choosing it of their own free will, that it's free of consequences, that they can take it or leave it or however they want to. And so, if I have a client who's like very committed to believing a certain thing, and I might even be able to say like, oh, that's going to be really difficult to work on or whatnot. I kind of look at it through the lens of trauma and going like, hey, like maybe we kind of keep hitting this resistance or whatnot. And we might talk about like, hey, from my perspective, I'm seeing that these things are connected here. I'm wondering, what do you think?
mm.
Like how could we, like, what would be the best way to proceed? Or maybe we just get off that track altogether. Like if this is the belief that you're wanting to keep, how might that fit what we're doing over here? Do we see a way to make them work together? Or are they totally separate or a contradictory of one another? And if that's the case, do we want to explore that? Like, does that feel helpful to you to be able to go that direction? Or do you say, you know what, I'm really not ready to go there yet. And so I think we need to move on over here. I am not the expert of somebody's life, and I don't want them to be a little version of me. That is not
Sure.
appealing at all. And so I think that those are really wonderful moments as a therapist. Keep yourself in check to say like, hey, this person, this is their sacred belief. And so if they're committed to holding on to it, we might check it out. We might explore it, but that's not ours to change. And we might be able to say like, hey, it seems like maybe if you're believing here, here's some other things that would go with it. Is that a problem? No? Okay. Then let's proceed. Like let's go with what we want. And I know it's more nuanced than just that, but
Of course.
I just don't see any reason why, like why we can't let people make their own decisions as it comes to faith and spirituality.
Yeah.
Um, I to me, it feels harmful to say otherwise.
Yeah. I
So,
think
yeah.
this is something that I come across a lot is obviously most therapists, I'm not massively familiar, I've become more familiar with how it works in America, but being a Brit, obviously we have a very
Yeah.
different system in place and a lot of the
Yeah.
same codes of ethics and things like that, but it's very
Yeah.
different. I mean, you cannot practice if you've not done, full degrees, if not doctorates and things. I mean, it's
Yep.
very hard to practice any form of therapy.
Yeah.
And yet there does feel like there's this kind of gray area with certain terms and things like that. And so someone can be practicing as certain things, whatever it might be.
Sure.
I don't know. Um,
Yeah.
and I have felt that generally speaking, even if you are a therapist who is under a strong code of ethics and really doesn't want to be swaying one's patient, right? Which I'm sure every therapist is like, yeah, no, of course, I don't want to do that. Maybe not every, but most. Maybe
Yeah.
again, the pastor therapist, I don't know how.
Christian counselors, they're a little different. Yeah.
Well, and this is the thing, right? So Christian counseling is very different to being a clinical psychologist, with
Right.
a doctorate in
Right.
psychology, and so if you've got a Christian that's got some sort of clinical background and has done the work, like it's very unlikely that they're going to be as biased. But I say that, but I have worked with people, many people who have gone to people that are very well trained, very well respected, definitely don't want to be biased, and yet being a Christian, this is who I am, and this is the fundamental framework of the universe here. We're talking about some very important things, and what I've found is it's really hard not to allow that to influence how you practice when
Yeah.
the person in front of you, it might be fine if they're an atheist and they're talking about, I'm struggling with my marriage and I want to help or whatever. It may be very different when they're a Christian and they go, I'm questioning some of these core foundations, that because what happens really on some level is you have your own ego backlash, right? Because then your ego goes, wait, let's question that. Holy shit, maybe I don't believe in hell or whatever, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I wonder, have you ever noticed, that on, because I can imagine going through your own journey, going through your own process of challenging some beliefs and things like that. And we've not talked about your journey. Maybe it would be fun to talk about that as well at some point. But you've been on your own journey and your own experience of religion. Is that, I mean, you must, as a psychologist, know that the ethic is there, but at times you go, fucking hell, that's really harmful. And I want to help this person. And actually, as a therapist, you're supposed to go, gosh, that's a harmful belief. I need to kind of correct. I need to help. How do you draw the line? I mean, this is like totally off the topic of religious trauma now. I'm just like, I'm fascinated. Like, because that feels like a complex one. I don't want to be, interfering with your faith.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, as a therapist, I'm supposed to be looking for things that are really holding you back, really harmful, maybe triggering trauma. Is there a way to, I mean, is that just a judgment call? I don't know.
I think there's this myth within therapy that the therapist is this cold, stone-faced, unbiased person. And to an extent, we can be unbiased, but before we are ever a therapist, we are human, and we are going to be human just like every person who walks into our office is human. So I think there's a responsibility for the therapist to recognize when their stuff is coming into it. And that might look like actually having to say something to the client to say like, hey, I got to let you know, like, this is coming from a biased place, or this is coming from my own opinion. I say that to clients sometimes, like, hey, this is my experience of this, or what I'm hearing you say, and this could be wrong because I'm filtering it through my own lens. Here's what I hear back. And I don't know, I could be wrong, but I don't think it's wrong to do that, to say, I need to let you know, this is how I'm filtering it. This is what I'm hearing. I think that actually creates for a greater ability to bond with one another, right? And then because that's almost like the opposite of like preaching or manipulation or whatever, because like where I'm trying to like slyly, like get you to a conclusion that I think you should get to. I think when we can recognize like, I am going to bring my own biases into this. And my commitment though, is not to not bringing bias in there. It's to recognizing when I am bringing my bias in, and to check in with myself to say, hey, this isn't your session. This is this person's session. And I need to let them have this. And if there is truly a toxic, harmful behavior or pattern or teaching or whatever that's going on, of course I might say something, but it's not going to be under the frame of like, holy shit, how the hell do you believe that? Right? it's going to be way different. And I think a good example of this is I work with a lot of domestic violence victims.
Yeah.
The one thing that I know from working with victims for 10 plus years now is you don't tell them what to do because they are so used to being told what to do and having their voice taken away. However, I can share with them that I'm really concerned about something. And to say, you know what, I cannot tell you that you need to leave right now. I cannot tell you this. And I'm very clear, like, I am not telling you what to do, but I do need you to know that what you just told me is very concerning. And I'm actually concerned for your physical or mental safety in this situation. And I don't use those words to alarm them. And I also don't use them frequently. So they know when I say them, it means something. And so I think that there is that piece of it too, that to say, hey, this could be the way that I'm interpreting it, but when you tell me that this is what's being taught, and as a result, X, Y, and Z is happening, that feels really concerning to me because it seems to me that you don't have the ability to actually make that choice. And correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe I'm not hearing it right, or maybe this works okay for you. My clients know, like, I think I probably say it every session, I could be totally wrong. So like, if that's the case, just let me know, disregard it. We can go a different direction. They're used to me saying that. But I think when we can say that, like, I'm going to bring my bias in. And if I say that I'm not, then I am probably not a great therapist because I'm living under an illusion that I am something that I simply am not. I'm a very relational therapist. And so I know, like, upfront, yeah, I'm going to feel a certain way, but I will commit to making sure that, like, that I'm aware when I'm bringing that into the room. And I want to let you know about that as well, if that's the case. And so then I preface it. This is my opinion. This is how I'm interpreting it. Here's what I hear when you say that. And I think that that gives them permission then to disagree with it, to tell me how it does work for them. That's great. Or to share, like, that feels really concerning. And I actually am concerned in a significant way for you. So,
yeah,
you know, I don't know that all therapists are like that. I am so thankful that I have done a lot of work on myself. I think that there are some therapists that don't go to therapy. That's a problem for a lot of reasons, but they might not be aware of that then. But there is a topic or a concept within therapy called countertransference. And that's this recognition of, like, the client is saying something that's triggering something in me that's impacting the way I respond to them. And across the board, regardless of what clinical profession you're in, the recognition of countertransference is, like, held up. Like, you gotta be aware of this for sure. So there is that, but yeah, we're not going to not bring our biases in there. Sure. We just have to be aware of them and how they play into it.
Yeah. I actually had a therapist at one point literally stop a session and say, hey, look, I'm really sorry, but where we're going here, I can't go because that's part of my journey, and I'll give you money back. I can recommend other therapists, but I think it's really important you work on this, but it's not fair for me or for you to do that. And I really appreciate that and respect that massively.
What a cool trust moment.
Right. And absolutely. And I learned so much about that as well. And I've also come across, because I don't do therapy at all, I'm very quick to go, hi, here's a list of therapists, here's some websites, here's, basically anyone that's messaged me on Instagram ever knows that that's one of my first go-tos is like, you do need therapy. Everyone needs therapy in my opinion. So I'm like, here's a list. But I do talk with people and help them process and listen to their stories and just, they're going like, how should I talk to my mom about after having this conversation? I'm like, oh, well, here's some ideas, or here's different things that might help. And the stories that you hear, it's a hard job. I can imagine therapy is a whole host of other levels of very intense things that can be very traumatic experiences for a lot of people. And so, absolutely. What you're doing is hard. And I guess recognizing things that are triggering or things that you're going, gosh, my experience is twisting this so that my input is going to be very much based on what I did, what I found helpful, whatever. And that's a really normal response, I'd imagine. I know certainly when I help people and give advice, it's definitely informed by my own journey experience, anecdotal things from talking to people and whatever else. Laura, would you be up for talking a bit about your journey and how I'm just really intrigued. One of the things that I often think about is a lot of people say, well, all these people that are coming out of church, all these people that are deconstructing, all these people that are questioning their faith, they all got this trauma and they're blaming us, right? And well, there's no one in the church with all this trauma, right? So I'm always intrigued talking to people that have had different trauma experiences or are very trauma informed. And so I guess before we kind of jump into that, I wondered, do you have thoughts on do you think staying in church protects you from actually that trauma surfacing, from actually experiencing trauma potentially? Like, because, yeah, I'm so fascinated by it because, like you said, people can have these exact same experiences and sometimes it's just not traumatizing. And maybe that's why they stay in the church, is it wasn't traumatizing. Maybe you come out because things are becoming too traumatizing. But is there an element as well where when you come out, you might suddenly be able to frame things in a way, or like, do you have thoughts on, like that dynamic?
It's like kind of like anything in some ways. Like it's sometimes it's very hard to see anything when you're in it. So we gain greater perspective sometimes the further out we get. We also have to look at the way a lot of religious systems work. I mean, the consequence for leaving oftentimes feels so great that we go, I cannot look at that thing. And I know we'll probably get into more of my story, but I mean, I have some very pivotal moments in my own experiences where I was like, this isn't real. This isn't right. This is not what I want to be a part of. But in that moment, to go any further with that question or to allow myself to linger any more on that feeling or that body sensation or that experience would have meant I would have gotten kicked out of the church. I would have lost my job. I would have lost my friends, my family, everything.
Right.
And so
the cost is so high.
The cost was way too high. And there came a point later on where the cost wasn't as high, so I could leave. And that's, kind of a different story or whatnot. But I think that is why it's so difficult. And not only that, but then we have all these beliefs and theologies and doctrines and whatever that promise all sorts of things are going to happen if you question, if you doubt, if you step away, if you disregard, if you reject, like whatever. And that's scary because like the ultimate consequence is like eternal conscious torment, right? So if I let myself go down this road with these doubts, or I let myself date this person who's not a part of this church or religion or whatever, like it's leading me towards this other life, these other thoughts, these other relationships that ultimately pull me further away and then get me ending up in hell, potentially, which is scary. Right?
Yeah. Oh, that's a terrifying choice.
Yeah. So it is very difficult. I don't think it's that you can't see the trauma while you're in it. I just think it's really hard. I can think of somebody where I've started dialoguing with them. It's somebody in my personal life. And I'm very aware of extreme amounts of religious abuse and trauma that this person is living from. And she can only acknowledge it this much because she's still in it. And she's had to find other ways to spiritually bypass and to cope with it in order to stay in that rather than acknowledging the immense amount of pain. Because acknowledging that would blow her world open in a way that feels too overwhelming right now, consciously intolerable. And so I can't say that for everybody. I know that there are people who can recognize certain things to even the fullest extent. My hunch is that that's not super common. Yeah. That it's
that sounds right to me. I mean, I only have anecdotal from talking with people, but it definitely feels, and I know like certainly for people just generally in this area, even just deconstructing, even like I've got some questions about certain beliefs or things like that. You start looking and then you think, hold on, this means losing my family, my friends, God, my relationship with God, my identity, my purpose, my job, because I took up a job in a Christian charity, or like it's like and you start to go, you know what, maybe I'll just put that question to the side, and it might not even be that conscious a decision, right?
Yeah.
It's not that you even, I think a lot of people do weigh up all that and go, okay, back away slowly.
Yep.
But I think a lot of people, that all happens under the surface, and they
Right.
just shut down and kind of, oh, I'm distracted, I'm watching a
Yeah.
bee now,
Yeah.
whatever it is, like,
Yeah.
oh yeah.
I mean, our nervous systems operate on our subconscious, right? And our nervous systems are programmed for our survival. And
Mm,
so it's not, to your point, it is often not a conscious choice to not question. It's that I feel the threat, we go in a different direction, halt
yeah.
everything that we're doing, turn around, go back the other way. So yeah, and when that's been wired into you, and you can see everything that you would lose, your entire livelihood, uh, it takes a lot to actually lean into that. It is more normal, if that's even a
Mm-hmm.
thing, to look back and to just pull back from that and to say that's too big of a threat. That is a threat to my very survival. I cannot go down that
Yeah.
path.
And
So
who could ever
yeah.
hold that against someone as well? God, I don't
No,
want that. Like,
no,
I hear, I went through it. I don't want that at all. I wouldn't
no.
want to do it again, even. I want the outcome, but I do not want
Yes,
to go, like,
the process,
and so
not
it's so hard, isn't it? Because it's easy to demonize someone and go, oh, look at them. They're not facing reality or they're whatever. And actually, usually that's not even on the table. It's not
yeah,
that they're being
yeah,
illogical or irrational or they're not facing things or
right.
it's a whole subconscious mechanism there just going, no, I just want Phil to feel safe and secure and
Yeah,
certain
yeah,
and be able to get through the next day without pooping his pants. If we
yeah.
could do that, that'd be great. But right now we're close to pooping his pants because he is terrified.
Yeah.
So we're just gonna back away, and Phil's never even gonna know that was on the cards.
I love it. I love that. That's
Yeah.
perfect. Yes,
Oh,
exactly that. Exactly that.
wonderful. Well, Laura, tell me a bit about your journey. Tell me about, you obviously are passionate about this whole area, and I don't think people tend to become very passionate about religious trauma without a bit of a story on their own
Yes.
journey. Were you born into the church, kind of brought up in that world?
Yeah, I was. I'm trying to, there's never a point where I wasn't involved in it. I mean, up until I left. But yeah, so I mean, I think the story goes, like 3 days after I was born, like was my first church service or something like that. Yeah.
Right.
So never had a time growing up where that was not a part of who I was and who my family was and what was prioritized and taught and those sorts of things. Excuse me. I When I was, let's see, fourth grade, I think, late elementary school, my dad took a position as a director for an evangelical free church camp. And
Okay.
so it was this year-round camp that people came to, a lot during the summer, but then on the weekends they would do retreats and whatnot. And, on some, like on the one hand, I'm like, I had some like really amazing experiences.
Right. I'm hearing
I had
that,
a,
and my inner
yeah,
like 8-year-old or whatever is going, "Are you kidding? This is the best thing
yeah,
ever! I get to live at
like,
camp." Like,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And so like, yeah, there's like a horse corral and a petting zoo and
Wow.
climbing wall and like, so there was some really truly amazing things that I think, of course, as a kid, I like took for granted. And now I'm like, oh my gosh, if I could like walk down the street a little bit and have like a beachfront and lakes and
Oh
boats,
wow.
it would be truly amazing. So, the shadow side for me, I guess, is that, it very much then of course informed how we lived and
Sure.
like one would imagine a camp is relatively, it's not close to anything. So, like my school was 20-25 minutes away. The church that we went to is 30 minutes away. And really, if it was a matter of having to prioritize activities, church obviously won over friends.
Sure.
And I've thought about that a lot because like, you know, during the summer, probably until for sure the summer that I could drive, maybe even the summer after that, I just wouldn't see any friends during the
Wow.
summer, any breaks, anything. I lived far enough out and that was not the priority. And so, um, yeah, so lived at the camp, but also was like very much affiliated with the church. I went to public school. For those people that don't know, like certain states have better public schooling systems. Minnesota, which is where I'm from, is one of them. So private school wasn't really a thing. But I do remember begging my parents, my mom specifically, to let me homeschool because I got
Mm,
to a certain point where I was so terrified of being like pulled down, by the
wow.
devil tempting me. And, and I couldn't see any way to get through middle school and high school being around the sinners, right? And of course you're supposed to like witness, but I was just like, I'm not strong enough to do that. And I think probably for a full school year I just begged my parents to let me be
Wow.
homeschooled. I think they considered it, and I don't know ultimately why they said no. I'm glad they said no. And I think part of it was my mom wanted to go back to work. She was a teacher. My dad's doing his camp stuff all day, and it is what it is. So I did get a secular education, but even that was very much infiltrated. I mean, we didn't have like overt purity culture teachings, but we had like education now and babies later. That was like
Mm,
the abstinence program that everybody did. And so anyways, I had this thought in my head that I think it was because I'd heard so many people's testimonies and whatever, that once I graduated from high school, that's when I would really commit to God. I would do this kind of lukewarm stuff, but that's when I got to like play around or whatever. And then once I graduated from high school, I'd really live from God. But I was so scared that like I never played around in high school.
right. You're wasting this prime opportunity, Laura. Come on. I'm
Yeah.
1000% the same. Like I
Yeah.
like was terrified at any juncture to like, no, we're not gonna mess around here. Not even
Yeah.
for fear of hell, just because I was a very timid person. I think I just
Yeah.
was so terrified of rejection or people laughing at
Yeah.
me or who knows what.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
was scared of punishment, like from like the punishment that I
Oh.
would get from my parents or whatnot.
Hmm.
And so, yeah. So it was just, it was what it was. And of course, during that time, when I was in middle school is when purity culture, like True Love Waits campaign, like really started to take
Right.
hold. So I was very much immersed into that whole lifestyle, did the whole purity ring thing, made the pledge of virginity, whatever. And I think it was probably like my junior or senior year of high school is when the purity culture books really started hitting the shelves.
Right.
And so that's when everything started being taken to like the next level and the next level. Josh's book, I Kiss Dating Goodbye. And the one that was particularly horribly influential on me was Dana Gresh's book called And the Bride Wore White. And just, I mean, it like covered every aspect of who you were and what you could say and how you had to have your body posture and the clothes you wore. And
So good of a guy to write that for all these girls.
so nice. Well, no, that was actually a woman, but she
Oh, it was a
quoted
woman.
Josh a lot. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Quoted Josh Harris in the book a lot.
Oh,
Yeah. So, was very much into that. And of course, high school ends. And I remember having this moment, like as I stepped outside of the graduation ceremony, I was like, this is it. Every choice that I make from this point on impacts the rest of my life and my eternity. And I'm like,
wow.
I was 17.
No pressure.
Right? No pressure. And so I ended up, instead of, I had scholarships to go to different colleges and universities, graduated at the top of my class, but I thought, well, all I'm supposed to do is get married and have kids. And so I guess I'll go to a community college to kind of like bide my time, and find a husband and then start having like 8 children. I thought having 8 kids would be like, now I'm just like, oh my gosh.
The end of that sentence to me is not positive. Having 8 kids would be base. There's
Yes.
only negative words I can think to put in there.
And I'm
Hell
so
on earth?
glad that, yes, I am so glad that this plan that I thought I was supposed to live did not happen. But yeah, I just thought, within a year or two of going to community college, like some man would see me as this, hopeful, godly wife, and that would be it. And it did not happen. So during that time, I started working at the church that I was going to. So it was a very fundamentalist, reformed theology church. I started working full as a paid position within the youth department, and kind of like slowly worked my way up. I was doing the youth director role, but wasn't allowed to be called a youth director because I was a
Right.
woman. And so the highest I could go was youth coordinator. Um, and that's, I think for me, I look at those years and I think I was there for 4 or 5 years, maybe. Yeah. And really devastating when I look at just what I had to believe that going back to this idea of like, I had questions, but to follow those questions through would mean this loss of job,
Right.
loss of community, loss of friends, all of these things. And at 18 or 19 or 20 or 23 years old, I wasn't ready to go there because I didn't believe I had worth as a human being, let alone a woman. I didn't have an education. I ended up finishing my 4-year degree in Christian ministry, like specializing with youth
Wow.
ministry. I'm like, I can't go anywhere. I'm a
Yeah.
woman, like, whatever. And so I really felt trapped. And I ended up starting to date somebody who the church elders and pastors did not like. And it
Mm.
wasn't because he wasn't a Christian or anything like that. They thought that I was not a submissive enough woman, that I was too, had too many leadership skills, that given the chance, I would bulldoze any man that I dated, but especially this guy. And he was younger than me, but the way they painted me to be as like this real ball
Right.
busting whatever, I mean, it crushed me as a person. And it just did a lot of damage. And mind you, this is a purity culture relationship. So like there was no kissing even. Like I had this commitment to wait until I was married to kiss.
Wow.
And so, I mean, I think like he kissed me on the hand a couple times, like after he asked for permission, because he was like,
Yeah.
we
I
were
mean,
committed
that's
to,
it, you know?
yeah. But the church leadership hated it so much that what they started doing is I think they knew that they couldn't fire me for that because I literally was not doing anything wrong. And so
Right.
they slowly started like making my world very small. They would take responsibilities away from me. They would say, well, we can't trust you with this group of people. So you're no longer in charge of that. We can't trust you with this group. And then they started getting people to spy on me and report back to them. And I know that sounds really like, weird, like, oh, you're just making it up. No, like literally my own family did it.
Wow.
And so everybody that was my support system was literally turning me in for things that did not happen. They would say, oh, I saw Laura pop up here with this guy or whatever. And I was like, that didn't happen, but I wasn't allowed to speak on any of that.
Hmm.
And I think really what the goal was that they wanted to drive me out. And ultimately they did. And, but even after that, I tried to leave the community and I thought, well, I'll go back to school to become a therapist and I'll work at another church and, go down to the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, which is the capital of Minnesota. And I would apply for jobs and apply for schools and interviews would go great. And then
Mm.
shut door. And I found out later that they had called every single one of those places that I had been applying to for jobs or school and just completely blacklisted me. And
Yeah.
and so not only then I've lost this whole community, but I was trapped in it. I couldn't go anywhere. So the only thing I
Mm.
could do was start to repent and repair. And so I basically, it was like anybody who had a grievance with me could sit down with me, unload, and I had to take responsibility for everything. And then, go on this apology tour. And so I did that because I didn't know what else to do. The cost was still too great.
Wow. Yeah.
Um, but through that, of course I wasn't working at the church, but I was volunteering all this time because that was
Hmm.
penance. But I did go and I worked as a recruiter for a community college and I hated the job so much that I was like, I'm going to start looking at other grad schools. And so eventually ended up at Liberty University, which is super fundamentalist, but whatever. Actually got a really good education there. But it was something about that was enough. It was like a little bit of hope. Like
Mm.
I did this for myself and
Yeah.
I'm starting to make a career for myself that isn't attached to religion.
Yeah.
And so that perhaps someday if I wanted to leave, I could. And so I think through that whole time as I was at Liberty, like I said, I actually really, they gave a great education. It wasn't Christian counseling. It was, it was a legitimate therapy program that they had to have all the specific classes. And so I think it was during that time that that's when I really started to actively deconstruct and just kind of going, gosh, like, like all these things that have been real black and white over the years aren't. Like when you start working with people, you're like, oh, that's not that way. Like that's
Mm-hmm.
like I've been taught all these things, but like I'm sitting across from this person and like it's not that. But I also knew that there was only so much I could do in that community. When you're so insulated, it's like I allowed myself to start asking questions, but there's only so many you can ask because you're still so oppressed by that.
Yeah.
And so probably with about a year left into my program, I decided I was going to move to Nashville, which is where I'm at now, which was like 12 years ago. And I thought, once I get there, that's when I will really be able to do it. And so to a degree that is what happened. I left the community that I was from. I got to Nashville and I was like, holy cow, nobody really knows me. I can do or be whatever I want. And not shockingly, I started by going back to church, and I was able to recognize, like, there was one church I visited that I actually developed some friends at that I was like, nope, this is too much like my other church. And so I was dating somebody at the time, and we went to this other church and a woman was preaching.
Wow.
And I was like, this is the first and last time I will ever be here. But I also couldn't deny that what she was saying was awesome. And also her husband was on this stage, and she was just like a guest speaker. So I was like, I can try this out. Right. And so I stayed there. I broke up with the guy, but I stayed at the church, and it was a really good stepping stone for me. It was a Southern Baptist church, which there's all sorts of problems with that, but there was enough wiggle room and permission of questions that it felt really, it felt free, to be totally
Sure,
honest.
yeah.
Nobody stopped me from asking questions. Everything was allowed. And I really started to appreciate that. In the meantime, I started dating somebody else who echoed that as well, where questions were fine. And he would kind of challenge me in a good way to say, like, I don't think that thing that you were taught is necessarily helpful, or it's not, I don't think that's right. I don't think most people believe that. And, it ended up being a very horrible relationship. It was marred by domestic violence and a lot of abuse. But I will always remember and appreciate that time where I was able to ask questions with freedom. And it also helped me get out of the faith even more. So I certainly would never wish that upon anybody.
Sure, that's not the recommended path out of
No.
faith. No.
Yeah.
So.
But what was interesting is that when I finally got out of that relationship, I started like comparing notes of like, he said this to me, and that sounds like what God says too. And I started getting confused. Who said what? Is this my earthly abuser, or is this the God that I just have been like serving? And it really led me into this position of like questions and curiosity and deconstruction. Like I literally remember getting a stack of index cards and like writing out, here's the belief, here was the scripture. And I set it down and then just started like, I'd pick up a card, like, okay, how is this not right? I was very technical.
I love it.
Yeah. And it was good. And, I still wasn't recognizing the trauma piece of it, but I was doing the best I could. I didn't know anything different. I thought I was the only person who was going through something like this. And in fact, part of the reason that I stayed in the abusive relationship as long as I did is that I genuinely thought I had to choose the lesser of two evils. I either had to stay with him or I had to go back to this abusive religious system. And I thought, well, this one feels better for the time being. And finally, I gave myself the third option of like, I guess I'll just be single for the rest of my life. So I don't have to have either. I'll just go for this third option. And so, but that's how indoctrinated I was. Like, I literally did not believe that there was anybody else out there other than the sinners that could, like have a belief in God or whatever. And I wasn't ready to not call myself a Christian. I wasn't ready to let go of all of that. That was too big. It was too scary. Like, again, the cost was too great.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, there was a lot kind of combined. So I really was doing the best I could. It was mostly cognitive. And, but eventually was able to get to a point where I was like, oh, I've like abusive relationship hopped my entire life, whether it's a relationship with God, a relationship with a pastor, a relationship with a romantic partner, they've all been incredibly abusive. And so understanding that was not particularly fun. And it really did take a process. The way I remembered it was like, oh, I just left. I was done. And then in reading like journals for my research and whatever, I was like, oh, no. This was a process of trying so hard to hold on, to shift. And I remember this day. So I work with domestic violence victims a lot. And one kind of widely known statistic is that, speaking of women, women in relationships with an abusive, domestically violent man will leave and come back to the relationship 7 times on average, before they leave for good or they're killed. And it's a really heavy thing to stay with. But I came to a point one day where I was like, that is exactly what I've been doing with God. For all these years, I've been coming back saying, maybe if I change this, well, let's try it this way. How about I'll work on this and let's whatever. And I was trying so hard to make this relationship work. And I remember sitting in my living room one day, and it was over something real benign. As it always is when ending abusive relationships, the thing that like breaks the camel's back is not the big assault. It's the really random thing that happens. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, wow, I see it. And it was something like I was wanting to buy a house. And I was like, I was never supposed to do this by myself. Like, I was supposed to have a husband and my 8 children and, like buy this huge house, and he was a pastor and whatever. And all of a sudden I was like, oh my goodness, I don't think God exists. Because for the last however many years, I've been in a domestically violent relationship, and I've shifted and shape-shifted and changed myself around, and you've never shown up. You've never done the things that were promised. And this is not because of a lack of belief. I have believed so hard that I've let all this other stuff slide. I have let God abuse me the same way I let my partner abuse me, because I thought if I could just keep trying harder and just change myself enough, then it would finally work. And then it was done. I was like, okay, we are done. It is over. That's the Taylor Swift song. We are never, ever getting back together. Like, that's it. And that was a good moment. And like any abusive relationship, it was not about me getting back together with God. But from that point forward, it started on getting over the impact. And that's where I really started to recognize the trauma piece of it. I've been in this abusive relationship for 30 plus years. This has a huge impact on my life, and I have to work on the trauma piece of it. So that's like an overview. And I know it's not all the details. I'm open to asking questions or whatnot, but that's definitely when things changed, and really reintroducing myself to my body and really processing trauma from that point has been pivotal. Like, I cannot say enough good things about body-based work, because it wasn't until I had been doing all this cognitive work and I still felt like shit all the time. And it wasn't until I started actually resolving that trauma through my body that I started seeing different symptoms decrease. I started seeing joy. I started liking myself. I started, liking my life and being really excited about what I could do and where I could go. And it's not a walk in the park. all the time. However, I am grateful that I've been on this journey. Like you, I would never want to do it again,
No.
but I am grateful for where I've ended up.
Yeah.
And I feel very like blessed, hashtag blessed for, my experiences and the people I've come across, on the day to day. I have a wonderful group of friends. We call ourselves the Black Sheep. And because we all came from the same background, same church, we were the ones that met over margaritas in secret to go, what just happened to us? So I'm really, really glad to have those people in my life, but it's been a journey. Yeah.
Yeah, gosh, well, it sounds it, and thank you,
Yeah.
because I mean, yeah, every person I've learned this over thousands of stories, that every story is so unique, and yet you see these broad brushstrokes, and you'll see the same maybe working with people in trauma. It's like, whoa, every traumatic experience is so unique, and yet there's that piece again.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's coming up, and it's so painful. I've actually got a piece I'm working on to post on social media about the parallels between people's relationship with church and leaving church, and people's and people that try to leave domestic abuse situations. And there's like 6 main markers, I think there were, and I looked at the 6 markers and I was like, oh, that's how everyone tries to leave the church and fails. And it's astonishing that dragged out. I read one statistic, I quote it all the time, by I think it's Packard and Hope, and they're Christian researchers, and they were looking at people that leave the church, and they had their Christian perspective. Their thesis, the number one thesis, was that, oh, people leave because they were hurt, and then they couldn't find one person out of 1,000 people that left because they were hurt. Not one. People were hurt, but actually people stayed for decades after they were hurt a lot of the time, and were hurt multiple times, and they kept hanging around. And one of the things that they came up with that really shocked them was that people, on average, when they asked retroactively, when looking back, when was the first time that you thought, I need to leave this church? And most of them, on average, it was 7 years before they left. People really struggle to leave this machine. And for a lot of us, it's, I was heavily involved in church to the degree where I was in leadership, my finances are wrapped up in that. I know that you had similar pat in that. But even for people that aren't so heavily wrapped up, it's really hard existential work. Like, who I am is wrapped up in this. I don't even know who I am without this stuff, right?
Your identity. Yeah.
What does that even look like? How did you go about forming that new identity? Like, did you have people that had come along and left church alongside you? You mentioned your Black Sheep family. Had some of them gone and forged ahead, so you kind of knew that you'd have people with you, or did you feel like you were just going out into the world on your own? Or, oh wow.
Yeah. So there was a couple pivotal experiences that I had, because so when I left the church, about a year later, another couple left the church also, and they are part of my Black Sheep family. And I think we don't totally know how important it was for us to be together, because we really did think this is a fluke. Like, there must be some. And to be totally honest, when we were coming out of the church, social media was not a thing. It just wasn't. I mean, Twitter and Facebook existed. I think Instagram existed, but like, it was not what it was today. And so there was one Facebook group that we were a part of, and it wasn't even like a post church or post religious. It was just kind of like asking these questions and going like, hey, this is a safe place to say this thing wasn't okay. Right. And so there was a couple moments that I had that really were like big wake up moments to me that seemed to push me forward, that I didn't know that I needed, but looking back, I'm like, that it's very pivotal. One of them was a quite personal experience in which, so I said purity culture, wasn't going to kiss until I was married. And so here I am, not too many months shy of 30, never kissed, even though I had actually come to a decision probably a year, 2 years before that. I was like, I don't think that that's really what I want to do. But I just hadn't engaged in anything like that.
Sure, yeah.
And so I had this sexual experience with the guy that I dated. I didn't know he was abusive at the time. And it was wonderful. So first of all these things are happening. I'm like, I thought I would be really ashamed to look a certain way in front of, somebody who's not my husband, or I thought I would have no confidence or whatever. And so as things are happening, I'm like, well, this is weird, because like, this is not how I was told I would act or how my
Right.
body would respond or, whatever. And I thought, well, I'm just caught up in the sin, whatever. And so the next morning I was like, I didn't want to get out of bed because I thought the moment that I will get out of bed, the shame and guilt is going to wash over me. And I finally had to get to this point where I was like, okay, that's just going to have to happen then. Like, and I will repent, and whatever God wants me to do to convict my heart, to take away all my leadership responsibilities, because I led worship at the church and, whatever. I was like, I'll do it. I'll pay for this sin that I've committed. And I got out of bed, and I kid you not, my feet were on the ground, and it felt, I can't even describe the experience. I call it sunshine. It was like I was connected to myself, to the universe, to God. It felt like there was sunbeams coming out of my heart. And I was like, shit, this is really bad.
Satan has got me good.
So far from God that like I can't even be convicted. I'm like celebrating my sin. And so I was like, I can't deny this feeling. This is so visceral and real. And I'm like, oh, this is like the first time like I felt my true essence in my body and whatever. And so it was a Sunday morning. So I thought, okay, I'll go to church. God will convict my heart there. Didn't happen. Okay, I'll go to small group tonight. Didn't happen. For 2 weeks, I'm like begging God, please convict me. I don't want to have a hard heart. Like, all these Christianese, whatever.
Right.
And I finally went to this girlfriend's house, and she was older. She older than me. She did not grow up in the church. She came to it later in life. So far less of like a fundamentalist, legalistic background. And I shared with her what had happened. And she just looked at me with so much sincerity. And she goes, do you believe you're being honest when you tell God that you'll accept whatever consequence it is for this sin? I said, yeah, absolutely. And I was like, he can convict me. I'm guilty, whatever. And she just said, maybe you don't create guilt where there is none. And I was like, oh. Wow. But then the next thought was, well, shit, if I believe that, I have to question pretty much everything that I've ever been taught. And so, but that was the point where the cost wasn't too high, because I had an independent life. I had a job that I was proud of. I could support myself. I still had this very abusive partner, not knowing at the time, but there was enough there that the cost was not too high to start asking questions. And so I did have that person come alongside me, but then relatively was on my own for a while. And so the thing that I kept telling myself was, at this point, I believe God is sovereign. He knows everything. So that means if I ask questions, like there's never going to be a point where he's like, oh shit, I didn't see that one coming. Now she's gone way too far that I can't get her back. And so I really had to like cling on to that belief that like, if God is really sovereign, then at some point he'll shut those doors, he'll turn me around, whatever it is, and he'll get me back. And that's where I just have to trust that. And so I did. And, a year after, so a couple of years later, I finally left the church. And then, about a year after that, this married couple friend, and we just kept asking the questions. And then there came a point where I was like, I don't need to trust that sovereignty piece anymore. Like, it's okay to just keep asking the questions. And so that's why, for me, it wasn't just this cut and dry, God exists or God doesn't exist. It really was a process. But I outside of my two friends for a long time, that was it, it was just us. And I'm so, so grateful. And I remember heard about like the Liturgist podcast and like heard Jamie Lee Finch, who is now a friend of mine, lives in Nashville, heard her like recite a poem, and then like just Googled her name on like Apple Podcasts. And I was like, oh my God, there's podcasts that people talk about this stuff with. I should listen. And so by that point, social media was like a bit more of a thing. I had left the church probably 4 or 5 years before that, but like that was so healing unto itself to go, even though I've already deconstructed a lot of these beliefs, I've really worked a lot of this through my body. The idea of just having other people who can walk this road with you is so powerful, to know that you're not
Huge,
alone.
huge.
And to know that there are these communities where people can just be like, I don't get this. Like, are you feeling this way too? Like, it is healing unto itself. I mean, it's huge. I'm so grateful for that. I wish I would have had it back then, but I'm okay that I didn't, because we have it now. And so that's why I love doing stuff like this, because I'm like, I know when I started listening to those first few podcasts, even though I'd already done all this work, it normalized so many more experiences that it was like, oh, like, again, this is the healing I didn't even know I needed. And here it is right in front of me. So what we have, like the resources that we have are just so incredible. I love that there's all of this accessible to us.
Yeah, no, it's extraordinary. I mean, what is available today versus what was available back whenever. I talk about this a lot, but Europe had a huge falling away of Christianity 70 years ago. And, most of Europe is now atheist, and yet the reason most of Europe is atheist is because literally when they had their falling away, they didn't have the internet. They had no one to talk to. They had no one to ask. So it was just kind of like, okay, so I don't believe some of these things. What are my options? Oh, I guess I'm not a Christian. Okay, cool. And that was it. Now, I think that's a totally great outcome. I think that's wonderful. I love my atheist friends, and man, most days I live like an atheist, I tell you. But I do think there's something quite beautiful about what's happening in America. Is this massive falling away that is in many ways replicated and mirroring what happened throughout Europe. In other ways, it's very different for very different reasons. It does feel like it's such a different experience because it's happening now. It's not happening in a place where people couldn't talk, where they couldn't explore, where they weren't seeing themselves in a mirror when they listened to people talk. And or now that's it, you Google it, and and even your pastor who hates you doing this and you've been too scared to say it, he's there preaching from the front going, the worst thing today is this thing called deconstruction. Don't search for deconstruction or go on social media and look for deconstruction. It basically what it is people that are questioning their faith, and that's the worst thing ever. And you're sitting there going, wait, there's other people questioning? I didn't know. Cool. I'm quickly Google hashtag deconstruction, or whatever, right? And so, right now people are just discovering this in a way. And, like you said, even if you've deconstructed for 4 or 5 years, I talk to people that have deconstructed 10, 20 years ago and going, this is helping me. Just give verbiage, a bit like what I was saying when realizing, oh, I have all these kind of autistic components to me. Yes. I had that as an 8-year-old, and now it helps me kind of integrate some of that childhood and go, oh, that's what happens. Oh, Phil, let me love that past self and kind of bring healing to that and allow that to flourish. And this is what's happening for a lot of people as they look back, as they're listening to podcasts and they're hearing someone like you that, has such a wealth of information and wisdom and guidance to share on religious trauma, but also such a beautiful story, and such a painful, vulnerable story. But such a story full of hope and healing that, oh my gosh, this is why I love to talk to people about their stories, because on some level, I live in the information, the academic, I just love it. I love that stuff. So I love having people on like you that's like, you're an expert. Tell me all the things, right? And I'll write it all down, and then I'll be an expert, and I'll never have any of these problems. That's not how it works, but that's how I think. But I love talking to people about their stories because I immediately go, oh my gosh, my heart. Because I've felt like that. Or, oh man, that's what that feels like. It's a humanizing process. It helps ground me and realize that I'm in the middle of something that millions of people are going through. Because it does feel like a lonely process. This even today, it feels lonely for a lot of people.
Oh yeah, trauma, shame, they breed in isolation. And so I think it's funny because, like I said, I didn't have. Other than my 2 friends, we didn't have social media or whatever, but we had the TV show Big Love, which is on HBO. It's a fundamentalist Mormon family, and
I'm immediately in. Yeah, I love stuff like this.
It's not reality TV or anything. It's not a sitcom. It's a drama, whatever. but we decided to watch it because it sounded good or whatever. And that was where we were like, oh my goodness. Like, we were taught that Mormonism was a cult, and we believe all of these same things. We do all of these same things. And there is just something like so like miraculous about seeing your life exemplified in somebody else that you're like, oh, okay. You know, the questions that I've had are, those were right on, you know, these practices that I've questioned. Okay. Yeah. All right. You know, and here's this group that we were taught was really evil. And yet they have almost the same beliefs that I do. I got to question that. And so, you know, so we didn't have social media. We had this little show, but even that was like a Hollywood, you know, whatever, was enough to start being able to see yourself in the story, to say, I think I can give myself more permission to like be honest and accurate about what has happened to me, be it trauma, adverse religious experiences, or what have you. And that it's just, it's so much permission, and not that we need permission from other people, but we think we do, especially when we're coming out of those systems. And so to have that in the face of others and just their lived experiences is such a gift that we can give to other people. So I mean, I think that's why what you're doing here is great. And so many of these other podcasts where it's like people are just sharing, because I mean, it's beautiful. It is truly beautiful. Yeah.
It's one of the best feelings in the world. Like I remember the first time I got really into Myers-Briggs personality type. But I remember the first time I did it, gosh, it must have been like 20 years ago or something now. And I remember reading the profile for I'm a INTJ. I don't really hold much stock in personality profiles anymore, but I'm reading the profile, and I found myself crying. And like I said, I'm not very introspective. I'm not very aware of my emotions. I've got alexithymia and different things like that. And so I'm reading and I'm just crying, and I'm like, someone gets me, like a printout from a computer or something gets me, but I'm like, this is me. And so even just, I don't even need a person to go, oh, that's like me. Just someone has articulated what I'm like. I'm not a freak. There's a category for me. That's great. Like, it's just something, it's something beautiful when you can go, oh my gosh, you went through that experience and you can identify that as wrong. That is so healing, because I thought it was wrong, but then I wasn't allowed to think it was wrong. I felt shame about it. I felt guilty about that. Actually, I thought I was wrong, or, you know, like all these things, and just seeing these things, giving us permission. Like you said, we don't need permission, but often we create the boundaries for ourselves that require us to give ourselves permission. You know,
Absolutely.
it is there. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. That's crazy. That's so good. Yeah.
Laura, this has been so fun. I could easily talk for hours more. This has been really great. I just, it's been really, really wonderful. I so appreciate you taking the time to share as well. You have so much stuff going on that is incredible. Tell people how they can dive into it. What's the best ways to be connecting with you?
All right. So I'm going to ask you a little insider question. When do you think this podcast is going to come out?
Ooh, hold on. I can tell you. It will be about a month, about 3 weeks to a month, I think. I'm just trying to remember what.
All right, because I'll tell you.
Ooh, and it'll be out. I can always push it back a week or two if you need to.
No, so your listeners will be the first to hear. So of course, I have my own practice here. Right now, my handle is Laura Anderson Therapy. It's going to be changing, and you'll hear why. Well, first of all, because I'm going to be getting my PhD, and it will definitely say Dr. Laura Anderson.
That took time and money, and we will be representing that on the screen. Yeah. Absolutely. I get that.
Yeah. So probably by the time this airs, it'll still be Laura Anderson Therapy, but if it's not, check Dr. Laura Anderson, and that will be my handle. I already have it reserved.
Nice.
So Instagram is the best place to find me, of course. I try to post every day. I post about a variety of trauma topics, but a lot about purity culture, religion, religious trauma, deconstruction, all of those sorts of things. Of course, you can also find me through the Religious Trauma Institute. Really pumped our website. Probably by the time this podcast drops, we'll have our website up, ready, done.
Amazing.
And just like Brian and I were going through it yesterday, and it's just so exciting to like see things materialized.
Oh, I
But the
can't wait.
project I think I'm most excited about is, as I've kind of referenced throughout this podcast, is I have a quite extensive waiting list, and I am great with my boundaries. I don't feel like I need to take on more clients, but have the stress of roughly 4 years worth of clients hanging out there saying,
Right.
I want to work with you. I I want to work with all of them, but I can't. And it's only growing, which is wonderful on a business perspective, but on a human to human level, I want to do more.
Sure.
So I am opening an online therapeutic coaching practice called the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery. And we are specializing mostly in religious trauma and all kinds of trauma, but religious trauma is where we will be specializing. And some of your favorite deconstruction therapists, I am hiring, which is super pumped. I'm like so pumped about this. Yeah, so we are all licensed clinicians who will be operating instead as coaches, which will allow us to see clients from anywhere in the world. And so all of our marketing and policies, it's all in line with coaching. It's just that we have a therapeutic background and access to those skills. And I am super pumped. I believe that by the time this podcast drops, there will be advertising and marketing done for it. The clients that are currently on my waiting list are going to get first priority because some of them have been waiting quite a long time.
Right.
But it will be open for the public. And so I think at this point, I have 7 other people that I'm hiring that will be starting with me day one. And I'm always looking for new, I'm calling them practitioners. To be working with. And really the goal is to be able to offer accessible, effective care for people that are wanting to work through trauma, specifically religious trauma. We'll be able to offer some sliding scale spots, support groups, the whole works, but I'm like really pumped about it. So
this is my dream come true beyond words because I tell you literally 5, 6, 10 times a day, I'm talking to people that need to talk to someone that's trauma informed and it's hard, there's great resources out there kind of pointing you roughly in the right direction, but it's hard, especially for Americans where you're limited by state and other components. And I am so excited. So how are people going to be able to find that? Is there going to be an easy way?
Yes, you can just go to, you can go to traumaresolutionandrecovery.com. Or our Instagram page is the same name, Trauma Resolution and Recovery. So there'll be a website. You can search, you can look at all the different practitioners, what they're specializing in. I've got an excellent assistant who is also a wonderful deconstruction person from Instagram. And we'll be opening the process to start getting people like pre-screening appointments and getting them connected with their practitioners and getting all of that set up. So I am super pumped. And if anybody hearing this is a licensed clinician wanting to work in that capacity, I have a hunch that the first problem we're going to encounter is not enough clinicians, not enough practitioners.
I was going to say, when this pod comes out and once you're officially launched, I will easily be sending 20 to 30 people a week to you.
Good Lord.
I'm not even joking. Easily, I easily come across that. A couple hundred messages a day, I'm easily getting 30 that are going, I need trauma-informed help. So
and that's just it.
You're going to get it.
There's nothing else like this. And so it's funny, sometimes you get that little imposter syndrome or whatever. And I was like, God, am I over promising these practitioners of here's the clients I can get you? And then I looked at my list and I looked at how many people have inquired just in the last year, which has increased for me over 500%. And I was like, and that's me marketing my practice. Like, I think that everybody will be as full as they want to be on that first day that we're open.
I have no doubt.
And we're going to need more clinicians. So
well, if you do need any help getting the word out there as well, like I am so happy to connect with other people in this space and say, look, these guys are doing this. You need to these need to be a go-to place for people to, because I think that's so important. And it's so important that we find people that, I trust you and Brian so much in what you're doing in the Reclamation Collective, guys.
They're so wonderful.
I say girls, really, but amazing. I'm so bad at saying guys. I'm trying to stop it and at least when I say it, notice it. But oh man,
it's all. Yeah.
It's at
Yeah.
least, dudes. I used to be dudes when I lived in California. So, I mean, I
There
think
you go.
guys better than dudes? Dudes just feels
Guys is
terrible. I don't know.
in some ways gender neutral.
um, but no, that is so exciting to me. I'm really, really excited. And
Yeah.
I guess, you're looking for people that are going to be able to come on board as well as practitioners.
Mhm.
What
Yeah.
kind of background do people need for that? Because I know that you guys, again, guys, um,
Yeah.
right? But with the RTI, you guys have been looking to try and help people kind of get trained in that area, and do that. If people are, because I get this question a lot as well, people going, how do I begin? And I send them your way, so I'm sure that you eventually get them at some point. But
Mhm.
how do I begin this process of,
Mhm.
you know, diverging and specializing within an area of
Yeah.
probably complex PTSD
Yes.
predominantly, but
Yes.
maybe even more specifically informing myself
Religious
about
trauma.
religion and how that works. Is that something that people can do without particularly specialist training? They can start that process quite easily, or
Yeah.
are you looking specifically for people that are like, no, we already have like a whole bunch of training in this area?
Yeah. So specifically for me, and also for the Religious Trauma Institute, I think the general answer is no. So the way that Brian and I operate is that religious trauma is trauma. Like I said earlier, just like sexual trauma is trauma, developmental
Sure.
trauma is trauma. So when we look at it from that perspective, that actually gives us so many more resources, more modalities, information, research that we already have access to, that we can then just like tweak little bits and pieces to say, hey, this piece is unique to religious trauma. So just like somebody who's suffering trauma from war may have some different impacts than some sexual trauma survivor, we just
Mm,
tweak it a little bit, right? There's going to be a lot of overlap and like almost 100% similarity in terms of how we process that through our body.
right.
But then like those other little consequences, yeah, like that's where we tweak it. And so really for Brian and I, and then for my center as well, I'm looking for people that are passionate about working with religious trauma and are at the very least trauma informed, but probably have some training in trauma as
Sure.
well. One of the things that I'm doing with my practitioners is, like we're meeting on a bi-monthly basis, or is that twice a month? Yeah, twice a month, to do group consultations specifically for learning more about religious trauma, case conceptualization, whatever else resources that they need. We'll be working with the Religious Trauma Institute to do trainings and whatnot. In terms of what the Religious Trauma Institute is looking for also is those same practitioner or clinicians that are going, I kind of know how to do this work, or I'm interested in it. I don't know the specifics of religious trauma. And so
Sure.
that's our goal then, is to be able to kind of do all the nuances and complexity with resolution and recovery as it pertains to religious trauma. So,
Sure.
but anybody can, especially with RTI, anybody can do those trainings.
Sure.
You can be a non-clinician, you'd be a survivor of religious trauma, and you're welcome to do some of those trainings. So
That's
yeah,
wonderful.
I mean, we have kind of those ideal kind of who it'll work best for, but it'll be accessible to pretty much anybody in terms of Religious Trauma Institute. Yeah.
That's amazing. I just
Yeah.
love that you're plugging all these holes everywhere, because I am
We're
someone that deals with
trying.
the holes every day, and I'm going, I have
Yes,
none of the skills
I
required to
know.
fix any of
No,
these things. All I
it's
just see is
so
all the
much,
holes. So
so much.
it's so exciting to see
Yeah.
all these things, people coming out of nowhere and going, hey, we've figured some
Yes.
options out and we're here to help, like that.
Mhm.
Gosh, that's
Yeah.
exciting. It's really encouraging. It's very hope. It fills me with hope. It's very a
Yes.
hope filled kind of
Oh,
thing of
yeah.
realizing, gosh, there's so
Mhm.
many people
Yeah.
struggling in so many ways that feels very overwhelming. Anyone that's got friends with trauma, maybe themselves have worked with trauma,
Yeah.
this is heavy. I mean, it's hard.
Mhm.
It's really painful to walk through and deal with. And thinking of sitting on a list, going, "Gosh, I found one person, and I
I
have to sit on a
know.
list." And
Yeah.
it's not to say shame on you for putting them on. Of
Yeah.
course not.
No.
Like, duh. But like, it's
No.
just like the thought of like, there's so few options for some people, right? They just
Yeah.
haven't come
Yeah.
across as many options. That they're like, I'm stuck.
Exactly.
I really am.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. I know we've gone
Of
on for
course.
ages now, so that's
Okay.
wonderful. And we'll have you on again at some point, I'm sure, to have a chat. Maybe we have you and Brian on at some point specifically. We can talk
Yeah.
about all sorts of new things. And I know that
Yeah.
with you working on your research, I'd love to explore that a bit more, and we could go into that. And
Absolutely. Yeah.
but yeah, like this has been really fun. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's so good to be here. I love the work that you're doing. I mean, I was talking to Brian yesterday. I was like, my days were all messed up, and because we were talking about, hey, remember, put Phil's deconstruction network on this page, for resources or whatever. And I was like, oh, I'm talking with Phil tomorrow night. And Brian's like, oh, I'm so glad that you are. This is so great. So we are big fans of you and everything you're doing. And I think you're just what you're adding into this conversation and the resources you're providing is so incredible and so needed. You've got this community and resources and doing it for free. And like, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, it's great to meet people that are in the same space doing wonderful things, and even better when they say nice things about me. That's wonderful. So, well, thank you very much.
So yeah.
Awesome. Well, Laura, thank you so much. Go in and enjoy your food. I know you said the only thing I've got to do is go food. I've kept you from that food for 2.5 hours now. So
it is all good.
And I'm sure your dog is excited to go and stretch its legs and go for a wander. So
yeah, she's looking at me like it's my dinner time too. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I am so sorry.
It's good.
Awesome. Well, it's been great to talk. I'll let you know when it goes live. I think it's going to be around the first week in April or so, give or take.
Okay. All right.
I'll run it by you, and if we need to push it a week or so as well, we can do that. So
perfect. Yeah. The biggest thing is as long as our website is up, that's what we're waiting for.
Let's time it for that as well. So like if it looks like that's going to go back, I can hold on to this for a month. Like none of it is particularly time sensitive, except for sure it comes at a helpful time for you. So
I will check with my web developer and see. She has a very hard date in mind. So I will I'll let you know what that is. And
I love people with hard dates. I'm terrible at setting hard dates. I set hard dates and just plow right past them. But yeah, that's a good thing to have in your life. All right, well, love you, Laura. I'll catch you later. Yeah.
Sounds good. Have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Ta-da. If you are deconstructing, there is no reason to do this alone. It can be an incredibly lonely process, but the deconstructionnetwork.com is a free resource to help you find others deconstructing in your local area. If you would like to support what I do, everything I do is for free, from talking to people for hours on end to producing resources and podcasts. It is only possible because people give generously. There's never any need to give. It will always be free, everything I do. But if you do, we do have an amazing private community group that we talk on over on Discord that you would gain access to. And we do regular audio and video chats on there as well. So it'd be great to see you in there. But of course, never any requirement. And of course, please, please, please come and talk to me on Instagram. I love connecting with people. I love helping people on their journey. If you need a safe space to process your deconstruction, I would love to connect. It's just at Phil Drysdale. Love every one of you. Peace.